Chapter 33. The Print Works. Saturday, May 25th, 1895. Lawrence knocked on the door of the coroner's office for the third time, then slammed his palm against a wooden panel. "He isn't in, no matter how many times you try," said Violet, reasonably. "It's frustrating," said Lawrence. "It's Saturday," Violet retorted. "You will have to wait until Monday now." Lawrence opened his mouth to snap a reply when he saw a familiar figure ahead. His frown changed to a smile, and he waved. "It's Michael." Michael strode out towards them, and Lawrence thrust his hand out. Michael faltered, and for an awful moment Violet thought he might refuse the handshake. But good manners and his position in the church got the better of him. "Good to see you at last," he said. "Where have you been?" "In Liverpool." "For a whole week?" "Yes." "It's none of my business," said Michael abruptly. "I suppose Violet has told you what happened to her?" "She did, and it sounds like she handled herself magnificently." "She nearly died, Lawrence, trapped like a rat in a cage." Violet glared at Michael, and he stopped, surprised at her demeanour. "I didn't realize it was that serious," said Lawrence. "Well, it was." Michael was in no mood to spare his feelings. "What brings you here?" he continued. "We were hoping to see Mr. Garrard," said Violet, "about the list of unnatural deaths." "Why?" "For further clarity," said Lawrence, speaking before Violet could answer. "We need to know the exact circumstance of the deaths, to know if they are suspicious." "You'll have to wait until Monday," said Michael. "We know," said Lawrence uncertainly. In all the years he had known Michael, the younger man had always been friendly. His attitude today was curt, and his anger barely concealed. Lawrence already regretted his behaviour well enough without criticism from his friends. "Or if you can't wait until then, go and see Edward Abbott." "Who?" "Abbott, the owner of the local print works." Michael pointed to a large building further up Mere Street. "I've just walked past the print shop, and it's open." "How will that help?" asked Lawrence. "An excellent idea," said Violet, clapping her hands together. "At least some of the deaths will have made it into the newspapers." "Oh, that type of print works," said Lawrence, enlightened. "Edward Abbott has produced the Dis Express since the 1860s, Michael explained. "I expect he keeps back copies." "Thank you," said Lawrence, holding out his hand again. "We will speak soon." Michael nodded in full comprehension of his meaning. "Until then," he said. Lawrence opened the door to the print works to find an entrance hall with a long counter running almost the entire width of the room. An open doorway behind the worktop allowed a glimpse of the heavy printing press which creaked and groaned beyond. A young man dressed in work clothes and a leather apron was standing behind the counter, squinting at a sheet of writing. He lifted his glasses and looked again before shaking his head in frustration. Lawrence coughed, and the man looked up. "Can I help you?" he asked, placing the paper into an overflowing wooden tray. "Do you keep old copies of your newspapers?" asked Lawrence. "Of course. We hold copies of every paper that ever went to press." "Can I view them?" "Not today, it's far too busy. We are only open because of the extra print run. No time for anything else." Violet flashed a smile. "That's a lot to get through," she said, gesturing to the tray. "Must you finish it today?" "Most of it, if I want to keep my job," said the young man. "This is the most important one of all," he continued, brandishing a sheet of heavy cream paper covered in tiny handwriting. "I would stand half a chance of completing it if I could only read Henry's scrawl." "Can I see?" asked Violet. He hesitated, then passed it to her, and she peered at the page. "Pass me that pencil," Violet commanded, pointing to a pot on the desk, "and a piece of paper." He handed her the items, and she marked the document with neat, precise strokes and passed it back again. "You sure that's what it says?" he asked, scrutinizing the page. She nodded. "Once you know shorthand, any writing style becomes easier to read." "I didn't know you'd learned shorthand," said Lawrence. "There's a lot you don't know about me." Violet smiled towards the young man again. "Is Mr. Abbott available?" "Not yet. He might come by later." "And what's your name?" "Charles. I am Mr. Abbott's apprentice compositor." "I see," said Violet. "So it's your job to set the lettering for the press?" He nodded. "Yes." I must produce 200 characters an hour, which isn't difficult as long as I can read the original document. Most of them are readable, but anything from Henry, well, I don't know why he can't make his writing bigger. It's my first time alone, and I don't want to let Mr. Abbott down. Perhaps we can help each other, said Violet. Why don't you let us see the back copies of the newspapers, and we'll sit quietly out of your way. You won't even know we're there. Then, if you have any problems with Henry's writing, you can ask me for help. How does that sound? Charles pondered the offer. I don't see that it can do any harm, he said. Come through. They followed him into the printworks, which smelled of paper and chemicals. Heavy wooden presses and compositors' cabinets filled the room. A desk had been set directly below the large window, and a composing stick full of letters was lying next to a handwritten design for a sales pamphlet. I'll be working here, said Charles, pointing to the desk, and the door to the paper room is through here. He opened another door into a well-lit room which was sparsely furnished apart from a desk, 2 chairs, and a gaslight. A large window dominated one end of the room, and chunky wooden shelves, stacked with binders, covered the adjoining wall. Don't come outside if you hear any voices, said Charles. I'm not sure what Mr. Abbott would have to say about this. We won't, promised Violet, as she sat at the desk. The door closed, and Lawrence moved the second chair opposite her. Where should we start? He asked. Violet retrieved her list and pushed it across the table. I have written an asterisk by the suspicious deaths, she said. You locate the binders, and I'll make a start. Lawrence nodded and reached for the first weighty tome, then manoeuvred it on the desk in front of Violet. She blew a layer of dust away, then located her handkerchief and wiped the residue. It's been a while since anyone's read that, said Lawrence, unnecessarily pulling down another binder. Silence fell upon the reading room, save for the rustle of pages as they both examined the newspapers. 10 minutes later, they had found nothing of note. Deep sighs from Lawrence punctuated the rustling pages. Patience was not one of his virtues. After another 10 minutes, he considered leaving the printworks and forgetting all about it, when an article caught his eye. He was halfway through reading it when Violet spoke. There, she said, pointing to a dog-eared newspaper dated April 1885. What have you found? He asked. A suspicious death. It wasn't from drowning, said Violet, but I marked it with an asterisk, and having read the report, it's certainly questionable. Who died? Susan Reynolds, she replied. Her husband found her dead in the washhouse. She was laying by the mangle and had fallen and injured her head. It doesn't sound very suspicious to me. But she was in perfectly good health. There was nothing wrong with her at all. The coroner ruled it natural causes because he could find no evidence of disease. She could have lost her balance. I suppose so. But the paper describes the wound on Susan's head as severe. Mark it as possible if you like, said Lawrence, but I'm not convinced. This one is worth checking further, though, he continued, poring over the page. It doesn't sound right at all, and I bet it isn't on your list. Why not? Because it concerned a young child, he said. It was a real tragedy. The poor little chap drowned in a barrel. Oh, no. Violet closed her eyes. How awful. The poor parents. According to the account, he went missing. When the searchers had exhausted all other avenues, one of the constables opened the lid of a barrel, and there he was. He must have fallen in. And lowered the lid at the same time? He couldn't have. Did they treat it as murder? No. The coroner assumed that he had fallen in and that later on, when the light was failing, someone must have inadvertently placed the lid on the barrel. That sounds silly. I agree. But that is what the report says. Then I'll make a note, and we had better keep looking. 2 hours later, Lawrence pushed his binder into the middle of the desk. That's it, he said. I can't see straight and I've got the devil of a headache. Have we got enough to be going on with? Violet scanned her journal. More than enough. We found reports for about half the names I listed. Those, together with the other records, gives well over 20 inexplicable deaths. Lawrence took the list from her. They're not in order, he said. Wait a moment. He opened his notebook and relisted them, putting a tick against each of Violet's entries as he wrote it down. Right. The first name on the list is Solomon Darby, who fell in front of a cart in March 1876. Next is Mary Green, who drowned in December of that year, and Mary Clark, who fell down the stairs in January of 77. Charlie Green was found dead in his bed in May 77. Any relation to Mary? Her 8-year-old son. The verdict on his death was unknown. The boy was perfectly healthy when he retired to bed. The father went to get him up in the morning, and he was cold and stiff. A drop of blood in the right nostril was the only unusual sign. There are too many children on this list. I don't like it. Next is Althea Carter, and then Fanny Nunn. Ah, strange. What? The next inexplicable death after Fanny is Charlie Adams in 1880, nearly a 3-year gap. But since then, there have been at least 1 and often 2 deaths a year. Extraordinary. My goodness. Violet's hand flew to her mouth. How dreadful. Don't you see what this means? Lawrence nodded. Oh, yes. There's a definite pattern. The murders started before the death of Fanny Nunn, and they have continued unabated ever since. Chapter 34. The Ironmongers. I can't believe it, said Violet for the 3rd time as she worried at her bandages with pale fingers. Stop that, said Lawrence, placing his hand over hers. They will unravel and you'll need to see the doctor again. It's just so horrible, she continued. Could we have made a mistake? Nothing is certain, said Lawrence. Our evidence is largely circumstantial, but we know that somebody killed Moyes, and his murderer is probably still living in Diss. Even if only one of the deaths is unnatural, it is one too many. And we don't know who did it or why. Do you think anyone suspects that we are investigating? They must do. Someone lured you into that empty house with the sole purpose of causing you harm. But how could they know? Have you told anyone why you are here? Only Michael. Mary Nunn thinks I'm a journalist. At least that's the story I gave her, and I think she believed me. But anyone could have heard you and me talking, or perhaps listened to one of my conversations with Michael. We can't trust anyone, said Lawrence, lowering his voice. What do we do? Lawrence walked towards the window and stared at the whitewashed wall beyond. We need to know why Fanny Nunn was so important. She was the only person named in the confession. Why don't we look at the newspaper report of her death while we are here? Her mother gave me lots of useful information, but there may be something more in the papers. Lawrence scanned the bookshelves and removed the volume covering December 1877. He drew his chair to the other side of the desk and sat next to Violet. Fanny's death had been the subject of several reports, and he located them quickly. They read the articles side by side, their heads bent close together. I'm not sure this helps, said Lawrence when they had finished. There's a dearth of available witnesses. Yes, both the surgeons are dead, said Violet. I found that out several days ago. Fanny's brother Christopher lives in London, and we can't speak to him. John Aldrich died last year, according to Minnie, and Harry Aldrich won't talk to anybody about Fanny. What about his sisters? Asked Lawrence. Both of them were witnesses, and the newspaper report suggests that the coroner took their evidence seriously. Violet scanned the paper again. I agree. They both heard Fanny drown. Do you think we should go and see them? If they haven't gone to meet their maker. Everyone else involved seems to have passed away. Violet smiled. But they were well past their prime. There's nothing sinister about their deaths, and yes, the Aldrich girls are very much alive. They'd been running the Ironmongers in Market Hill since their father died. We could go there now. Good, I think we should. And let's hope they're a little more forthcoming than their brother. The Misses Aldrich were a long way past their prime, which momentarily confused Violet, who still had the 1877 newspaper reports fresh in her mind. She'd overlooked the fact that almost 2 decades had passed and they were no longer young women. From the moment Lawrence opened the door to the ironmonger's and ushered her through, Violet was ill at ease. She reached the counter first and asked the middle-aged woman behind it where she might find Miss Louisa Aldrich. When the woman replied that she was Louisa, Violet could not conceal her surprise. Louisa Aldrich wore a smart black brocade dress. Though the modest dress looked simple, it was finely tailored and of excellent quality. Louisa was taller than Violet and looked older. It was difficult to estimate her age, but fine crow's feet and raised veins on the back of her hands gave clues to the passage of time. Slim, with pale, unblemished skin, Louisa wore her hair in a tight bun exposing a long, slender neck. Her deportment was elegant, and she carried herself with the confident poise of a woman who knows her place in the world. The well-organized ironmongers in which Louisa kept shop smelled like the blacksmiths in Violet's childhood village. Items of metalwork hung from hooks on the ceiling with smaller pieces arranged in drawers or tidy stacks. Violet felt a wave of nostalgia, half expecting a horse to push its head through the stable door at the rear. "How may I help?" asked Louisa. "A pair of hinges and nails to fit," said Lawrence, pointing to a half-open drawer containing a small and, hopefully cheap, set of brass fittings. Louisa retrieved them and deftly wrapped the items in a piece of newspaper which Lawrence recognized as last week's copy of the Dis Express. "Will that be all?" "And some information, please," Violet added. "Certainly. What would you like to know? I'll fetch Mr. Baxter if you need something forged." "It's not that sort of information," said Violet. "Nothing to do with the shop." "Oh?" Louisa's brow knitted momentarily. "I hoped you would answer some questions about Fanny Nunn." "Why? The poor girl died a long time ago." Violet caught Lawrence's eye and hoped he would follow her lead. Her persona as a reporter had worked well with Mary Nunn, and she thought it worth repeating. "I'm working for a magazine," she said. "I don't believe you," said Louisa directly. Violet opened her mouth to protest, but the words would not come. Something close to a smile played across Lawrence's lips. Violet scowled at him, furious at his enjoyment of her discomfort. "I saw Mary Nunn yesterday," said Louisa. "She has told half the town that she will be receiving an award from your magazine." "That's not what I said," Violet protested. "It's the way she has interpreted your words," said Louisa. "Take whatever you said and multiply it by a large dose of wishful thinking. The result will be Mary Nunn's version of events." "Isn't she reliable?" asked Violet. "To a certain degree," said Louisa. "She does not lie so much as exaggerate the truth." "Then what she feels about her daughter's death is not necessarily what happened." "It might be. But equally Mary could have embellished things. She is a good woman, but prone to overstating the situation."
"And she is singularly indiscreet," said Lawrence.
"Yes, I asked Mary not to say anything about the award."
Violet was intentionally curt, hoping that her faux outrage would distract Louisa from further questions. She did not want her to guess their real purpose. In the event, it did not matter.
"Well, now we've got that out of the way, what do you want to know?" "I won't ask why you are inquiring. Be as nosy as you like. My brother has already spoken about you, Miss Smith, and a friend of his is a friend of mine." "Thank you."
Violet smiled weakly. She had feared a hostile reception from Louisa.
"You already know that I've spoken to Fanny's mother. She mentioned you briefly, but I didn't realize your close involvement until I read it in the newspaper." "Yes, it was an unsettling experience," said Louisa, "and one that I shared with my sister. We were home together that night, but Alice heard the cries first. Perhaps it's best if I fetch her." Louisa unlatched the stable door and disappeared out of sight.
"Well recovered?" said Lawrence, grinning. Violet shook her head.
"You enjoyed that, didn't you?"
"I don't think I've ever seen you lost for words."
"I have some choice words for you," she hissed as the door reopened. "This is Alice," said Louisa Aldrich, presenting an identically clad and similar-looking woman, also in her late 40s. It was only Alice's slighter stature
and a large silver cross that she wore on a chain that differentiated one sister from another.
Alice has agreed to tell you everything she heard. Please take a seat.
Violet murmured her thanks and moved towards a small table tucked away in the back corner of the store. The three women sat down on the only 3 seats available, and Lawrence loitered by the counter feeling awkward. Louisa was about to speak when the door opened and an elderly man hunched painfully over a walking stick hobbled into the shop. He approached Lawrence and looked him up and down.
"New boy, are you?"
he asked. Lawrence forced a smile as Louisa Aldrich glided towards the counter.
Mr. Seeley, how are you today?
"Middling," he said. "My poor old bones are playing up."
I'm sorry to hear that. What can I do for you?
"You sent this,"
he said accusingly, producing a crumpled piece of paper.
"It says I owe £15.
That is correct.
I don't have £15.
You do surprise me,
said Louisa with the air of a woman facing a regular problem.
"So I can't pay you."
The man propped his stick against the counter and crossed his arms.
Can you pay any of it?
"I might manage £5 at a push,"
he said, pursing his lips.
Then give me £5 today and another £5 for the next 2 months.
"That's more like it,"
he said, reaching into his pocket.
"Fancy sending me a bill for the whole amount. I don't know what your father would say."
I've written it in the book,
said Louisa, ignoring the slight. Look, £5 paid, £10 due. I'll see you again next month. The old man grunted and retreated towards the doorway.
Let's try again,
said Louisa, taking a seat.
My sister says you've been asking about Fanny Nunn,
said Alice. Her voice was quiet with a distinctive lisp.
Yes,
said Violet. It would be helpful if you could tell us everything you remember about Fanny. Alice gazed into her lap. She seemed less confident than her sister and struggled to make eye contact.
I remember a great deal, she said. It is not the sort of night easily forgotten. It was late, getting on for midnight, I think, when Harry called me to the window and asked if I could hear noises. I opened the latch and listened.
She paused and transferred her glance from her lap to the window pane. Go on, said Violet. Alice blinked and continued, still staring into the distance.
I distinctly heard a cry, she said. A female voice was wailing in distress. What did she say? She said, "Don't," and she said it several times. The words were unmistakable. What did you do?
Violet leaned forward and looked into Alice's eyes. She did not return her gaze.
I went to Louisa's room to seek her opinion. Yes, said Louisa. So I opened my window and heard the same shrill cries. Oh, don't, save me, help me, the voice moaned. And then there was a dreadful silence followed by a long shriek.
Violet shuddered.
How awful. It was, said Alice,
turning to her sister. Louisa reached for her hand and squeezed it.
It affected us all in different ways. Harry will not speak of it at all, and Alice still has nightmares even after all these years. Did you hear anything else? Yes, gurgling sounds which were coming from the direction of the mere near Park Fields. I heard this immediately after the cries.
Many believe that Fanny took her own life, said Violet. Alice shook her head vigorously.
She did not. Are you certain? Positive. The cries were quite distinctive. Fanny was screaming for her life.
Did you hear anyone else?
No, only Fanny's voice.
What happened next? Lawrence spoke from his vantage point midway along the counter. Both sisters jumped at the sound of his voice.
My father and brother went to look for her, said Louisa. They thought she must be in the area of the mere near Mr. Muskett's garden. They met a police constable in the street, and he joined them in their search. They followed the sounds until, by the light of their lanterns, they saw a young girl struggling in the water. She was about 20 feet from the bank. By then she was no longer crying, and all they could hear were a series of groans. They called out to her, but she did not reply.
Did they try to save her?
Of course.
Louisa's voice rose in indignation.
There were 2 boats moored nearby. My father and brother attempted to push off, trying first one boat, then the other. But both boats were in a state of disrepair and utterly useless. My father called to a passer-by to fetch a length of rope. By the time it arrived, it was already too late, and the poor girl had disappeared into the water. There was no moon that night. It was pitch black and too cold to make any further progress. So they abandoned the search until dawn. Poor Fanny. Violet sighed as she imagined the terror of the drowning girl. Next day, Louisa continued, they dragged the mere and recovered Fanny's body. You know the rest. The sisters fell silent. Violet tried to find something comforting to say, but nothing came to mind. Thank you for your help, she said finally. We understand better now. Do you? Said Alice. She met Violet's eyes for the first time. I think so, said Violet slowly. There's something I haven't told you yet. I don't believe I mentioned it to you, Louisa. It didn't seem important at the time. Fanny was in the shop on the day she died. I happened to be there with my father when she came in looking for straps for her suitcase. She was in good spirits and told me that she was going away to Norwich but would be back the following week. Curious, said Violet. I have heard that she was in low spirits and upset. Alice cocked her head. Not upset. Nervous would be a better description. She didn't express any concern or upset about the journey she was about to undertake. Her only reservation was a meeting later that day. Meeting? Louisa appeared surprised by her sister's statement. Yes. Fanny had arranged to meet someone before leaving for Norwich and anticipated a difficult conversation. You didn't mention this at the inquest, didn't I? I haven't thought about it for nearly 20 years. I can't remember if I said anything at the time or not. I don't suppose it's of any importance. Lawrence and Violet exchanged glances. It could be, if Fanny was murdered, he said. But the meeting could have been with a friend, protested Alice. The comment about the meeting didn't sound sinister, and the fact that she purchased the straps for her case has more relevance. It proves that she intended to leave Dith. Your recollections have been most interesting. Thank you again, said Violet, rising from her chair. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate your time. They emerged from the ironmongery and into Market Hill. That changes things, said Lawrence. Violet nodded. Possibly. But she could have been referring to a meeting with her sweetheart, Alfred. I thought you said she spent the evening with him. She did. Then it wasn't that. We need to find out who else Fanny met that night, and why she was so nervous. Chapter 35. The Cupboard. Didn't you like it? Asked Lawrence as Violet pushed her dinner plate away, almost untouched. I liked it well enough, said Violet, but I've lost my appetite recently. Hardly surprising with all the worry. Haven't I apologized enough? Lawrence gave a half smile as he leaned across the table and looked into Violet's eyes. I shouldn't have left you on your own. I don't know what I would have done if your injuries had been any worse. It won't happen again. I wasn't asking for another apology, said Violet. There is no need. Can we forget all about it and please stop monitoring how much I eat? It's annoying. Shall we retire to the lounge? We may as well. Violet was still angry. Her relief at having Lawrence safely back was waning, and his insistence at clucking around her like an old hen was taking its toll. They walked into the front room of the Crown. There was nobody around, and they took their choice of seating to the side of the fireplace. Violet sat by the window, and Lawrence drew up a chair to face her. Where is everybody? Asked Lawrence. In the market room, I suppose, said Violet. There's enough noise coming from it. She stared distractedly towards the fireplace and sighed. I want to go home, she said suddenly. Lawrence raised his head in surprise. But we haven't finished, he exclaimed. We may never finish. This investigation lurches on and on. I want to sleep in my own bed for once.
We shouldn't be here much longer.
How do you know? Do you think that a confession will magically materialize in front of you? It's not going to happen, Lawrence. He opened his mouth, but she continued in full flow. It's not been the same for you, swanning off to Liverpool for days on end. You've left me here alone, feeling ill much of the time, and to what purpose? Violet looked as if she was about to cry. Lawrence took her hand. Come on, old thing. It's not like you to complain. She flashed him a withering look. I want to go back to Bury. You stay here if you must.
Very well, if that's what you want.
She nodded her head.
Then I'll take you to the station tomorrow, but let's talk about what we have learned while we are still together. Give me the benefit of your wisdom so I can manage without you. Lawrence was downcast as he spoke.
Where shall I start?
With your opinion on the whole affair.
She nodded. There is some evidence of a crime, she said. For once, it's worth investigating. Somebody pushed Fanny into the water, and her depressed behaviour leading up to her death caused doubt over the guilty verdict. Some think she was suicidal, but the evidence suggests otherwise.
I agree, said Lawrence.
And Alice Aldrich thinks that she was meeting someone. I spoke to Alfred Wiley, and he did not mention a meeting, neither did Mary Nunn, but she told me that Fanny was loitering as if she was waiting for something.
Interesting.
And Alfred said that Fanny told him she would be leaving £30 in the pocket of her ulster under the willow.
Which wasn't there.
The arrival of a large group of young men carrying tankards interrupted their musings. The men weaved towards the other window seat, too close for comfort. Lawrence raised his eyes and grimaced.
Great, he said, just when we were making progress.
Oi, Barney!
One of the men stood and held up his half-empty tankard. He waved it in the direction of a man coming through the doorway. The other man waved a hand towards him and retreated.
You were saying? Continued Lawrence.
I said the money wasn't there.
Violet lowered her voice as she moved closer to Lawrence. Do you think she intended to leave it?
She had nothing to give him, unless... Violet put a hand to her mouth. Oh.
She turned away, distracted as a roar came from the group of men. They'd clinked glasses together and were starting to sing. We're leaving, said Lawrence. Come on.
Wait. I've had a thought. What if Fanny had a means of getting money, but it was risky?
I don't understand. Lawrence moved from the table and sat next to Violet.
She could have met someone with the expectation of procuring money.
You mean blackmail?
Yes.
That would explain why she was nervous.
The singing petered out as Minnie Panks bustled into the room. Keep it down, she snapped. Go in the market room if you want to behave like that. She glanced sympathetically towards Violet.
Get me another min,
said a hang-toothed, wiry man. I'll serve you in the market room.
Oh, go on. Don't do it, said another man. Ratty has nothing left except his burial club money, and his missus will do for him if he spends that.
They all laughed. That's it, exclaimed Lawrence, grabbing Violet by the hand. He pulled her into the hallway and peered into the dining room. It was empty.
This way.
They sat down at a table in the corner. What do you know about burial clubs? Only that they are the salvation of the poor. 2 young children died last week, and their parents were only able to give them a decent funeral because of the Oddfellows' money. Edward Bowden paid burial dues, said Lawrence. And Mary Nunn. What are you suggesting? Lawrence thought for a moment. Only that it's very convenient. But it's not a large amount of money. Only enough to cover funeral costs, with a little over. A little over could mean a lot in a poor household, and even more if there was an insurance policy. Really? Violet seemed doubtful. Don't you remember the Liverpool scandal? Perhaps not. You were in the wrong part of the country. It was all my uncle spoke of for weeks. A chap called Higgins died. His mother-in-law poisoned him and collected something in the region of £100 in burial club payments. That's a lot of money.
and worth a £30 bribe if someone found out.
You mean Fanny?
Lawrence nodded.
You don't think the Oddfellows are involved?
Not directly. But we might be able to find out who benefited from the payments by checking their records.
They won't agree to that.
I know. And I wouldn't ask them. Where do the Oddfellows keep their paraphernalia?
Here, of course. That's one of the reasons they meet at the Crown. They have no premises of their own. There's a large cupboard out the back where they store banners, regalia, and the like. I suppose they might keep documents too.
Good, said Lawrence, stroking his chin. Well, there's only one way to find out. There was a stark contrast between the Crown in the evening and during the early hours of the morning. The busy public house had quietened into a silent, creaking menace, ready to waken any of the occupants with the slightest misstep. Lawrence inwardly cursed for the third time as he tiptoed down the passageway to the groan of floorboards. He passed Violet's room, hoping that she had followed his request to get some sleep, ignoring the temptation to check. As he reached the top of the stairs, he glanced towards the landing windows. They were both open, and the curtains billowed in the light breeze. Lawrence covered the stump of his candle, which he'd concealed in a tin top to protect it from draughts. He could ill afford to lose his only source of illumination. Every tread of the stairs produced another moan from the ancient wood until Lawrence finally reached the bottom. Holding his makeshift lamp aloft, he surveyed the area to the right by the reception area. Light glinted off the gun cabinet opposite the wooden counter housing the room keys. Lawrence edged through the small gap in the counter facing a wall containing several rows of hooks. Bunches of keys were hanging there, each affixed to rough-hewn wooden tags etched with room numbers. The end hooks held 2 chunky keys, probably for the external doors, and the other, a bunch of varying-sized keys of indeterminate purpose. Lawrence grabbed the latter and made for the rear of the building. Moonlight illuminated the sizable rear room, revealing a double-doored recess with twin brass fingerplates and a lock set below. Lawrence crept past the room and almost tripped over the Panks' elderly cat, which lay prone on the rug by the fireplace. Its yowl pierced the silence, and Lawrence grimaced as it stared balefully towards him, hackles raised and spitting in fury. He waited with bated breath for the proprietor to descend, but silence reigned, and he continued in his task. Lawrence tried one key after another from the enormous bunch and was beginning to lose hope when a tarnished brass key turned in the lock. He opened the double doors and entered a storage cupboard large enough to be a separate room, but for the lack of natural light. The commodious closet could easily have held a double bed and furniture. Instead, it contained shelving stacked with various items of Oddfellows' equipment. The cupboard hid a treasure trove of regalia. Large banners leaned against the side wall, and items of apparel adorned the rear shelving. Lawrence set his paltry candle on a round table in the center of the space. He advanced towards the shelves and picked up a black-rimmed apron from a shelf marked Mourning and examined it. The words Memento Finis lay between a depiction of the sun and stars. He shivered as the candlelight picked out crossed keys above a skull and returned the item to its place next to a set of black sashes. Lawrence checked the shelving and noted a dozen sets of ceramic mugs, beneath which were dusty tomes of records, coated in a thick layer of dust. They looked as if they had lain unused for years. Lawrence collected his light source and settled cross-legged beside the books. He pulled one out and tilted it towards the candle, squinting at the untidy handwriting. Inside was a register of Oddfellows members dated 1883 and of little use. He tried another and another, until he opened the 4th register, which turned out to be a ledger full of accounting records. Gritting his teeth, he turned the pages and peered at the entries. The writing was clear and easily readable. The Oddfellows' treasurer must have been methodical. Each page recorded the month and year of the starting transaction, and the book contained about 12 years' worth of records. The accounts were in two parts, the first being general expenses and the second a history of fund payments for burials and sickness. Lawrence scanned the pages. On first glance, everything seemed in order. There were instances of multiple payments to the same family member. That might have been suspicious, but it was a sad fact of life that death was commonplace, especially when caused by disease. The amounts involved were not vast, though they could have been tempting if money was in short supply. But all in all, there didn't seem anything untoward in the records. Lawrence sighed and returned to the front of the cash book, this time focusing on the description. The ruled columns recorded information about the deceased. They included their relationship to the claimant and a witness who was usually a doctor. Entries started in 1882 and the pages ran out in January 1894, at which point a new ledger began. Lawrence sighed. It was getting cold, and he was sitting on a stone floor. He manoeuvred himself into a squatting position and took a final look at the register. As he considered the attraction of returning to his warm bed, a record caught his eye. The entry bore the witness signature of a woman, notable because the majority of the others were by men. The woman's name was Amy Sullivan. Lawrence flicked through the pages a second time, searching for more records in her name. She featured on all the preceding pages, but entries petered out in 1891, with the last one early in 1892. Who was Amy Sullivan? And more importantly, where was she? Lawrence closed the book and returned it to the shelf, all the time wondering how old she was. The dates of her entries were significant for no other reason than her disappearance from the records in the early 1890s. Could Amy Sullivan be the woman they were seeking? As Lawrence stood, his numb legs buckled and he tripped into one of the banners. It fell to the floor with a clatter. The candle tipped over, splattering wax over the floor and across the spines of the registers. Not again. He sighed as the cupboard plunged into darkness. He waited alone in the unlit closet while his eyes grew accustomed to the dark. The outlines of the unfamiliar regalia took on monstrous proportions, and the metal jewels glinted like eyes. A headless mannequin wearing a Grand Master sash seemed to have moved ever so slightly from its original place. Lawrence gulped. His imagination was running wild. He would rather risk explaining himself than spend another moment where he was. He pushed open the cupboard and scanned the room. It was empty, and even the cat had disappeared. Encouraged, he tiptoed into the rear lobby and then into the entrance hall. With a sigh of relief, he alighted the stairs before feeling ice-cold metal shoved against the nape of his neck. A low voice growled, "One move, and I'll shoot." Chapter 36. Seeking Amy. Sunday, May 26, 1895. Lawrence was rarely embarrassed and considered it a wasted emotion. Once a thing had happened, there was no reversing it and no point in worrying what people thought. But today was an exception. He had crept into the dining room behind Violet and sat in the furthest corner in a futile attempt to avoid bumping into George Panks. "What's wrong?" Violet had asked, and Lawrence shrugged as if it was unimportant. "You seem like a cat on hot coals," she continued. "Anyway, how did you get on last night?" "I found out something interesting," he said, neglecting to mention his encounter with their host in the early hours of the morning. Lawrence could still feel the cold barrel of the shotgun in the nape of his neck. He squirmed at the thought of the awkward moment when he'd had to explain why he was prowling downstairs with a large bunch of keys in his hand. Unable to think of anything more convincing, he had told George Panks that he was hungry and looking for something to eat. Panks had lowered his gun and, in deeply sarcastic tones, had offered to fetch him some pie. Lawrence had no choice but to accept, and suffered the further humiliation of George Panks serving him at a table in the dining room. His host sat opposite and watched silently across the table until he had finished every last crumb. "I found a candidate for the Skoll Confessor," he said quickly. "Have you?" "I think so. Her name frequently appears as a witness to the funeral payments." "Who is she, and what makes you think she might be the writer?" "Amy Sullivan. I'm only speculating about her involvement, but the entries she witnessed stopped suddenly, and I wondered if she died." "Or left the parish," said Violet. "It's worth a look," Lawrence protested. Violet agreed and returned to her room to collect the notebook in which she had written a list of burials at St. Mary's. "It's no good," she said, closing the notebook. "She isn't here. I didn't think she would be. I would have remembered a name like that." "We can look elsewhere." "Don't forget that I'm leaving today," Lawrence sighed. "I hoped you'd have a change of heart." "Well, I haven't." "Why don't we try the Skoll Parish records?" "If you insist," said Violet. "But it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. We don't even know that she's dead." "I've got a strong feeling about this," said Lawrence as they left the hotel and took the Skoll Road. "You always say that when you want me to do something that's against my better judgment," Violet complained. They arrived at Skoll Church to the peal of bells as the congregation departed from the Sunday morning service. "Good timing," muttered Lawrence. "We should have made an effort to get here earlier. I haven't been to church for weeks." "You don't go every Sunday in Bury." "And you only go on high days and holidays." The arrival of the vicar interrupted their bickering, and he greeted them like old friends. "Ah, there you are," he said. "Oh, come in, come in." They exchanged puzzled glances and followed him into the porch. "Which one of you is Molly?" said the vicar jovially. "Only joking," he continued, watching Lawrence's stern expression. "Neither one of us," said Violet. "Oh, you're not here to talk about marriage?" "No. We're here to see your burial record." "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were Mrs. Davenport's niece. Oh, forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," said Violet pleasantly. "But may we see your parish register?" "Certainly," said the vicar. "Are you looking for anyone in particular?" "Yes," said Lawrence. "Amy Sullivan." "Oh, yes. Poor Amy. Death came quickly in the end." "You knew her?" "For many years. Amy's family came from Ireland and settled here while she was still a young child." "She died young?" "No, Amy must have been 50 or more. She lies in the churchyard now and has been there for at least 3 years." "How did she die?" asked Violet. "She died of cancer," said the vicar. "But she did not suffer for long." "How sad for her family." "You didn't know them, then?" "Not at all." "Oh, quite, or you would have known that all of Amy's family predeceased her, mother and father, as you would expect. But she was the last of her siblings. Even her niece died young, poor little mite." "She must have been lonely," said Violet. The vicar smiled. "Anything but," he said. "She was a nurse, and before that, a midwife. There was a good turnout for her funeral, though I expect Polly was responsible for that." "Polly?" Lawrence spoke for the first time, having been content up to then for Violet to take control. "Polly Grundy, her best friend. They were thick as thieves at school and stayed close all their lives. Speak to Polly if you want to know more about her." "Where does she live?" "Ivy Cottage. Come." He beckoned them from the church and strode in the direction of the Norwich Road. "There," he said, pointing to a small cottage in the distance. "You should find her at home. She only left church half an hour ago." Lawrence and Violet approached Ivy Cottage to see a stout woman clad in a brown dress with her face and hands hidden from view. One gloved arm held a woven skep, and the other grasped a smoker into which she was blowing assiduously. Bees buzzed lazily from an open hive as she peered inside. Lawrence leaned over the stone wall and coughed. She carried on, oblivious to his presence, and he tried again, this time with more success. She walked towards him, lowering her veiled hat. "Yes?" she asked, cocking her head in a gesture of mild curiosity. "We've come about Amy Sullivan," said Violet. "Amy Sullivan," Polly echoed. "I haven't heard her name in a few years. What's she to you?" "A cousin of my mother's," said Violet without batting an eyelid. Her conscience had become less troublesome over the years, and she was fast becoming an accomplished liar. "Who was your mother?" "Bridie Smith." Another lie dripped from her lips without a moment's delay. "She never mentioned her," said Polly suspiciously. "My mother's Irish," Violet replied. "Of course," said Polly. "Amy went back to Cork a few times. I never heard her mention a Smith." "That's my mother's married name." "Well, that explains it," said Polly, evidently satisfied. "You know that she died, don't you?" Violet shook her head sadly. "I know now," she said, "but not when I set off. My mother is frail, and when I told her I was visiting Dis, she asked me to call in and pay my respects on her behalf." "You will be returning with sad news, then," said Polly. "I wish it wasn't so. She was a good friend, and I still miss her." "Can you tell me anything about her? Mother hasn't seen her for over a decade. It will make the loss more bearable if she knows a little of how she fared." "Of course, my dear," said Polly. "Why don't you come inside and I'll make a pot of tea?" They followed Polly up the path to the front door of her stone cottage, and Lawrence stooped as they entered the small porch. The cottage stood in stark contrast to the pretty, sunlit gardens. It was cold, dark, and even smaller than it seemed on the outside. Polly opened the door into her tiny parlour and gestured to a pair of wooden chairs. "Sit there, my dears, and I'll fetch your drinks through." They sat in silence and admired the bucolic view beyond the garden, wishing Polly had chosen to talk outside. The door creaked, and Polly appeared bearing a wooden tray with 3 chipped cups and a pair of saucers. She stirred the tea, set the cups out, and waited for it to brew. "What do you want to know?" she asked, a smile flickering across her weather-beaten face. Violet tried to guess her age. She'd likely be close in age to Amy, and therefore in her early 50s. But if her appearance was anything to go by, she'd had a hard life. Her eyebrows were grey and sparse, and tiny hairs protruded from her chin. Deep grooves furrowed her brow, and the tendrils of hair beneath her white cap bore only a trace of chestnut brown. A patchwork of age spots covered her gnarled hands, and her knuckles looked red and painful. "Tell me anything," said Violet. "Anything about her recent life." "First and foremost, she was a nurse," said Polly. "Caring was in her nature, and looking after people was all she wanted to do. She put their needs before her own and was kindness itself, especially at life's end. She had a particular horror of dying alone, and would be there to hold a hand or provide comfort to those approaching their final hours." "Did she ever marry?" "Goodness, no." "She might have, had she not been so cynical about men. An unrequited love early on, you see. It put her off for the rest of her life." "Who was he?" "Oh, I don't know," said Polly. "She would not say, and although I often asked, she refused to tell me. It was a source of shame to her because he did not love her back. Well, not enough to make an honest woman of her." "Perhaps he couldn't marry," said Lawrence, incautiously, "if he already had a wife." Polly raised an eyebrow. "I don't think that is likely," she said, lifting the lid of the teapot. "How long did this infatuation last?" "Decades, for all I know." Polly picked up the teapot and poured. She pushed the cups with saucers towards her guests and took the one without. "He must have liked her somewhat," she continued. "She owned nice things that she could not have bought from a nurse's pay." "Does Amy have any living relatives?" asked Violet. Polly shook her head. "She was the last of the Sullivan line. There's nobody except your mother and perhaps a few distant kin in Ireland." "That's a pity. I would have liked to have met Amy's family and asked for a memento for my mother. A likeness or a letter would mean a lot to her." "I can help with that," said Polly. "You have a picture of Amy?" "I might have. When Amy died, her furniture went to Aldrich's auction house, but she left me a box of personal items, nothing expensive and only of sentimental value, but you are welcome to see them and choose something for your mother." Violet felt a momentary pang of guilt at her kindness, but it was too good an opportunity to waste. "Yes, please," she said, "and thank you so much." "Come this way."
Polly guided them up a narrow flight of stairs to an even darker landing with a door on the right and 2 uneven steps up to another door in front. "Mind your head," she said as they trod on the spongy floorboards. "I won't come in. It's more of a box room than a bedroom, and it won't fit us all. I'll be downstairs if you need me." Lawrence squeezed into the room behind Violet and stood at the doorway with his head bowed. "Calling it a box room is a gross exaggeration," he complained. "I'll stay here, otherwise I'll get in your way." Violet reached for the wooden crate, which was the only box-shaped item in the room and presumably the one to which Polly Grundy had been referring. She blew a thick layer of dust from the top and sent the choking particles into the damp air of the room. Lawrence sneezed and retrieved a handkerchief from his pocket. Polly's description had been accurate. The box contained trinkets of no discernible value. Amy seemed to have a penchant for carved wooden animals. A small collection of elephants, a tapir and a rhinoceros were gathering dust in a chipped glass fruit bowl. Violet removed them together with a beveled hand mirror and placed them on the floorboards. An ugly vase, a brass ring and a hair comb soon joined them. Violet continued removing objects until the box was almost empty. Then she noticed something underneath a leather-bound notebook. Violet pulled the shiny object out and held it aloft. At first glance, it looked like a medallion, but when she took a closer look, it was an Oddfellows jewel. Lawrence whistled. Where did she get that from? He reached for the medallion and examined the back for identifying marks. There were none. Violet, in the meantime, had opened the notebook. She passed it to Lawrence without speaking. He licked his fingers and turned the pages. Accounts, he said unnecessarily. Records of money collected with dates by all the entries. Her wages, perhaps? Asked Violet. Or something more sinister. Hello, what's this? He extracted a piece of folded paper from the back of the notebook. A letter from an admirer, he said. Listen to this. My dearest Amy, you are the cleverest girl. Brains and beauty personified. I will act at once upon your suggestion. The Mere again? Or is it too soon? Either way, there will be a bit for you and a bit for me, as always. No doubting it now, said Lawrence. Amy was right in the thick of this business. The only question remaining is who was there with her. Chapter 37. Cat Among the Pigeons. Lawrence and Violet walked towards Dis, both preoccupied with the exact nature of the crimes involving Amy Sullivan. She'd been colluding with somebody, probably male, and they'd conspired to obtain burial money for profit. But, said Lawrence, stopping to emphasize his point, it's not a great deal of money. The largest amount in the book was £100. If Amy and the other party had shared the proceeds, after factoring in a funeral payment, there would be barely any money left. A lot of risk for little benefit. I know, said Violet. I am not happy with the logic behind our theory. There must be something else that we are missing. And someone else, said Lawrence. Violet shuddered. It makes my skin crawl, she said, to think that it could be somebody we know. And we still have to determine what we are dealing with. We don't know how many deaths were natural and how many were criminal, or whether they were opportunistic or planned. And if the latter, then it's cold-blooded murder for sure. Anyway, Violet, we must hurry along now. You have a train to catch. I thought you didn't want me to go. I will be a lot happier when you have left. Violet fell quiet, and they walked in silence as Lawrence considered his previous remark. That is to say, I won't have to worry about your safety when you are away from this snake pit, he said hurriedly. I know what you meant, she said. My feelings weren't hurt. I was just thinking. About what? About what we ought to do next. There isn't enough evidence to bring the matter to the attention of the police force. I expect they would laugh at us. My thoughts exactly, said Lawrence. The time for subtlety is over. I'm going to set the cat among the pigeons. How? By making our suspicions public. And where are you going to do that? I'm not sure yet, he admitted.
But it's one of the reasons why I would like you well out of the way." They had walked briskly and taken a more direct route leading past the railway station. "It's a pity we didn't think to send your bag on," said Lawrence over the rattle of a passing train. He watched the brightly painted engine chug into the distance, steam billowing from its funnel. His heart sank at the thought of Violet leaving, but he knew it was for the best. "We should talk about suspects," said Violet. "Have you any thoughts?" "Not really," said Lawrence. "It's reasonable to suppose the involvement of the Oddfellows, but it may not be direct. I'm not suggesting it was one of them, but at the least they must know the perpetrator. This person is probably a male, but not a young man. He would have to be in his 40s, but more likely in his 50s if he was an admirer of Amy Sullivan." "We should have hung on to that note," said Lawrence. "Someone may have recognized the handwriting." "Not after almost 20 years, said Violet. "And the writing was terrible, but the fact that it exists at all rules out the illiterate. And the crime itself involves a low cunning, more likely found in someone with a good education," said Lawrence. "Let's assume that it was an Oddfellow," said Violet. "There was a jewel in Amy's possessions which could connect to the note. Now, the Oddfellows meet at the Crown every Sunday." "This evening?" "Yes, every Sunday evening. So why not make a public declaration there? Even if the Oddfellows are not involved, there will be enough of them to hear and repeat what you have to say. It will be around the whole town by tomorrow." "Good. Yes. That could work well." "In that case, let's go back to the Crown and pack your bag," Lawrence said, looking at his pocket watch. "You can be in Bury by 5 o'clock. "Or Overstrand," said Violet. "Why on earth would you go back to Overstrand?" "Because I've had a fascinating thought." "Go on." "You didn't find the skull confession in Redhill Street, did you?" "No." "And neither did William Miller. You know he didn't. Where is this leading?" "You didn't find it because it wasn't there. It had already gone by then." "Gone where?" "It could have gone anywhere, but I am hoping against hope that it went to Overstrand." "You mean that it was in Edward Bowden's Bible? I didn't see it." "Did you open every page?" "No, but it was in my possession for the best part of a day. I think I would have noticed." "Not necessarily." "And Bowden was fond of the Bible. If it had been there, he would have found it." They had reached the Crown by now, and Lawrence held the door open as Violet entered. "That's all true," said Violet, walking past the empty lounge and towards the stairs. "But I still intend to check." "I thought you wanted to go home." "I do, desperately," she said, climbing the first stair. "But I can't sit idly by while you place yourself in danger." She clung to the newel post as she turned and spoke. Lawrence gazed up at her in admiration. She was plucky and spirited, and he had mistreated her. "Never again." "It's not worth it," he said. "Go home, and I will return as soon as I have announced the presence of a murderer in their midst." "No." She shook her head. "I will find somewhere to stay overnight and send you a telegram tomorrow. I will be back in Bury in no time. By then, your plan may have come to fruition." Lawrence smiled. "As you wish," he said, before following her upstairs to help with her packing. Neither one of them heard the rustle of a newspaper coming from the lounge, which had not been as empty as it first appeared. The sole occupant of the room glowered and lowered a copy of the Dis Express. Once again, their luck had held. Once again, there was a problem, but a resolvable one. They folded the newspaper, rose, and walked towards the chemist on Market Hill. Lawrence tapped his fingers across an empty table in the lounge and stared across the hallway for signs of life. He'd adopted a strategic position near the door, taking advantage of the view into the market room where the evening's gathering would take place. Lawrence had checked the meeting arrangements with Minnie Panks earlier, and she'd dispensed the information without asking any questions. Violet had been right. Minnie lacked natural curiosity in the same way that Lawrence lacked patience. The wait for 7 o'clock seemed interminable, and Lawrence glanced at his watch. It was approaching 10 minutes to the hour. He might have reasonably expected some signs of life by now, but he was still the only person downstairs.
Lawrence began to wonder if there had been a cancellation. His eyes grew heavy and unfocused as he waited. Boredom set in, and he leaned on the table with his chin propped up on his hand, trying to remain alert. Then, without warning, the front door swung open, and a group of men milled towards the market room, their voices gruff and low. Lawrence recognized some of the men from previous evenings at the Crown. Their faces were solemn and bore none of the jollity of the crowd of young men from the previous night. They filed into the market room and sat upon the wooden chairs, waiting in virtual silence for the meeting to begin. Lawrence remained seated, hoping that they would not shut the door, but after the last man entered, it swung back, muffling the sound of the speakers. He got to his feet and picked up a discarded newspaper which he pretended to read while loitering in the hall. When the coast was clear, he pushed the door open an extra inch, creating a partial view of the room without revealing his position. Lawrence leaned nonchalantly against the wall in case anyone else arrived and wondered what he was doing. After a few moments, Harry Aldrich made his way to the front of the room and coughed. He was wearing a black sash and a similar black-edged apron to the one Lawrence had seen in the cupboard the previous night. Aldrich made a sign that Lawrence didn't understand and gestured for quiet before pulling a piece of paper from his apron pocket. "Bow your heads for Robert Moore," he said. "Brothers, will you join me in recognizing the dedicated and zealous service of our friend Robert Moore, a dear friend cut down in his prime in a wanton act of murder? Brother Moore rendered valuable assistance with fundraising in his capacity as Deputy Treasurer. He has been a loyal and faithful member of this lodge, and is held by his brethren in high esteem. We, his friends, lament his loss." "Amen." A murmured "Amen" followed from the seated men. Harry Aldrich continued. "It is our sad duty to assign his position to another, and in these circumstances we may accept proposals outside of an annual general meeting. Yes, George." George Fairweather, who had been sitting ramrod straight, stood up. "I have a proposal," he growled. "Go on." "I propose we find the filthy cur who killed him and string them up in the marketplace." Harry sighed. "It's neither the time nor place to have this conversation," he said. "But what are they doing about it?" demanded another man at the back of the room. He rose to his feet to make the point and glared at his friend on the right-hand side, who reluctantly joined him. One by one, every man stood. Harry turned towards Arthur Thompson, who was sitting with Joseph Pope in the front row. "What's the latest news, Arthur?" he asked. Arthur Thompson joined Harry and faced the hostile crowd. "There was an examination of Brother Moore's body, as you know, and there will be an inquest here on Tuesday afternoon. There is no doubt that he drowned." "He didn't drown. Someone murdered him," said the man at the back. "As I was about to confirm before you interrupted," said Arthur. "Though there is room for doubt, both the surgeon and the coroner report bruises and cuts to Robert Moore's head. More specifically, there were finger marks to the side of his neck, marks that may have been caused if someone held his head beneath the water." There was a shocked silence, followed by a shuffle of chair legs as the men returned to their seats. Arthur continued. "Though Robert's death is common knowledge, I appreciate that the details are new, and I'm sorry to give such a graphic description of his final hours. He did not deserve to die so horribly." "He did not deserve to die at all. What are they doing to catch his killer?" George Fairweather was still standing in the middle of the room, eyes blazing with fury. Harry and Arthur exchanged glances. "The authorities are conducting a thorough investigation. They're doing the best they can." "Which isn't much from what I've seen," muttered Joseph Pope. He was sitting, legs apart, hunched over his ample belly with a rare frown across his face. "No," agreed Arthur. "So far there has been little progress. I would have hoped for more."
"Someone is going to get away with murder,"
said George Fairweather, pulling off his sash. He hurled it to the floor. I won't mourn him until they've caught his killer, he snarled.
Harry opened his mouth to speak, but Lawrence had already spotted what he suspected would be his best opportunity. He strode into the market room past the stony-faced men and towards a startled Harry Aldrich. Turning to face the group, Lawrence held up his hand for silence. "Be careful what you wish for," he said dramatically. "For the murderer of Robert Moore is a member of your organization."
"No."
Joseph Pope eased himself from his chair.
"That cannot be. We are good men, charitable and kind. You have seen the work we do.
Nevertheless, one of you is a killer, and he has killed more than once." There was an explosion of angry voices as the men protested their innocence.
"Leave this meeting at once," said Harry Aldrich in a controlled voice barely containing his fury. "How dare you come in here and insult the memory of our friend?"
"I dare, because whoever killed Robert Moore also killed a young girl, and not just her, there have been others, the names of which you will learn in due course. And make no mistake, I will find this killer. Consider my words tonight. Think about what happened to your friend. Then look around this room and ask how well you know your neighbour. Where was he on the night that Robert Moore died? Cast your mind back 20 years. Could he have killed Fanny Nunn?
Fanny Nunn killed herself.
George Fairweather snapped out of the almost catatonic state into which he had fallen upon hearing Lawrence's words.
"How do you know?" asked a man at the back. "You didn't even live in Dis back then. Stop!" Harry Aldrich snapped, his anger in full flow. "Don't entertain this fantasy. We are brothers. Do not cast suspicion upon each other." He turned to Lawrence. "Do as I say, and leave." "Yes, get out."
The man at the back stood and made his way towards Lawrence, his friend trailing in his wake. "I'm going," said Lawrence, lunging for the exit. He sidestepped the large man and grasped the door handle, then left, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He reached his room and sat on the edge of the bed, deep in thought. It had been a good night's work. He had undoubtedly lost some friends and a great deal of goodwill, but he had made an impact, and something was sure to come of it. 5 minutes later, he reached for his wallet and found it absent. He patted his jacket pocket and checked his coat, but to no avail. The wallet was missing. He wondered where it could be, and just as he began to panic, he remembered. The last place he'd used it was in the lounge. He'd been counting cash while killing time, waiting for the Oddfellows to arrive. The wallet must still be on the table. Lawrence crept downstairs, and as he reached the bottom step, a low murmur emanated from beyond the closed door of the market room. To Lawrence's relief, he saw the familiar shape of his wallet on the table and grabbed it, turning back towards the stairs. But directly in his eyeline was the portly form of Joseph Pope, hunched by the market room door and breathing laboriously. "Can I help?" asked Lawrence, hoping that Pope wasn't as antagonistic as the other Oddfellows. Joseph raised his head to reveal a florid face crowned by sweat-streaked hair. He uncurled himself and fanned his face with a chubby hand. "Quite well, thank you," he muttered. "It's just a combination of this damnable business and a touch of indigestion. I felt quite faint for a moment." "You should get some air," said Lawrence. "Yes, I will." Joseph shuffled towards the front door and stumbled over the tattered doormat. "I'll join you," said Lawrence, concerned. Pope's face was ashen, and he looked as if he was about to pass out. A light breeze graced the April evening, and Joseph Pope raised his face towards the wind. "Oh, that's better," he said. "I'm sorry about your friend," said Lawrence, "and I'm even sorrier to be the bearer of bad news regarding his connection to the Oddfellows." "Robert was a fine man," said Pope. "I have known him all my life. It's hard to believe he is gone. And when you said it might be one of us—" "Was that the moment you felt unwell?" "Yes, it was. The thought of it. Those men are my brothers." "Including Harry Aldrich?" "Of course. Why ever not?" "No reason," said Lawrence, "except that he is in charge. Sometimes that distinction creates barriers to friendship."
"There are no barriers, I can assure you," said Pope. "We respect each other equally, and that applies regardless of our standing in the town."
"What do you mean?"
"Well, George is a blacksmith and works with his hands. I am a teller in the bank, and Harry owns a thriving auctioneering business. Yet we are all close friends."
"Is it true that Aldrich takes on house clearances?"
"Yes, a fair few."
"He must see some interesting things."
"I dare say, and some dull ones too. Some of the furniture is in such poor condition that it's only fit for firewood."
"And personal possessions?"
"He takes them too and sorts them into items of value. Anything else ends up on the rubbish heap. He auctions all the valuable stuff."
"Including books?"
"I expect so. I don't know."
"And you believe him trustworthy?"
"I would stake my life on it,"
said Pope firmly.
"I'm not sure what you're driving at, but you have picked the wrong man in Harry. He is a committed Methodist and honourable in all his dealings. Now, please excuse me. I feel better and will return to my friends now,"
he continued, emphasizing the word friends, as he turned and re-entered the hotel. Lawrence was about to follow him when thoughts of Violet stopped him in his tracks. He would give anything to discuss the events of the evening with her. She didn't need to comment to keep him on track. A nod of her head or an occasional word of sage advice was good enough, and his instinct would pick up from there. He missed her, and the thought of going back to an empty room was too depressing to contemplate. He decided instead to walk to Scole and prevail upon Michael for companionship and a bed for the night. Chapter 38. Testing for Arsenic. Monday, May 27th, 1895. Once Michael overcame the surprise of Lawrence's unexpected visit, he greeted him warmly and welcomed him with a large glass of port and a good supper. Michael abandoned his plan to write to his brother that evening. Instead, they sat talking into the small hours about the case, speculating whether Violet had arrived in Overstrand yet. Michael had already offered his spare room to a friend, but his sofa was available. Lawrence accepted it and slept surprisingly well, waking at daybreak. He joined Michael at the table and they breakfasted on eggs and bacon before Lawrence returned to Diss. The sky was cloudless, and despite the early hour, the sun's rays were fierce. Lawrence was perspiring heavily by the time he returned to the Crown. He strolled through the hallway, almost bumping into George Panks, who shot him a withering look. Unabashed, Lawrence climbed the stairs, removing his jacket as he went, relieved to be free of the heavy clothing. He poured a jug of water into the blue and white porcelain basin, splashed his face, and toweled it dry. The cold, refreshing water made him feel thirsty, and Lawrence reached for the smaller drinking vessel by his bedside table, then poured himself a drink. He raised the scratched glass to his lips, then stopped at the sight of a hair floating in the liquid above a fine layer of sediment. He fished out the offending object and wiped it on his trouser leg before stopping to consider the implications of what he had just seen. A hair in a glass was unfortunate, but the fine white sediment below it was something else again. He sniffed the water. It was odourless and colourless. But for the presence of the stray hair, he wouldn't have looked twice at the contents. He swirled the water around and rechecked it. The substance had very nearly dissolved. For a moment, the temptation to put his finger in the liquid and taste it was overwhelming, but common sense prevailed. Instead, he sat down on the bed, trying to organize his thoughts. Yesterday, he had deliberately and provocatively set out to display his suspicions publicly. Today, he had found a strange substance in his drinking water. The connection between the two things was unavoidable, and he wasn't about to take a chance. He emptied the contents of his glass into the white ceramic jug and thrust the empty drinking vessel deep into the pocket of his trousers. Draping his coat over the water jug, he set off downstairs to find the helpfully insouciant Minnie Panks. 10 minutes later, he had gained enough information to know that Mr. Gostling, the chemist, would be at his home in Linden House. Lawrence walked the length of Denmark Street and entered Gostling's driveway at a lick of speed.
Linden House was a handsome property set well back from the road. Lawrence climbed a small set of steps to reach the doorway located beneath a balustraded balcony. He rang the bell, and a young servant girl greeted him. She waved him through the door and left him alone in the spacious hallway while she went to fetch her master. Lawrence began to feel uncomfortable as he waited. It was one thing asking for an opinion in a drugstore, but quite another invading a gentleman's home. He needn't have worried. Thomas Gosling grasped the potential severity of the situation as soon as he had finished speaking. "You've come to the right place," said Gosling, reaching for the jug. "I'm almost retired, you know, but I have a small laboratory in the back of the house and more than enough equipment to conduct a Marsh test." "Marsh test?" echoed Lawrence. "Yes," said Thomas Gosling, leading him through a corridor and into a room that smelled of sulphur. "It's as good a detector of arsenic as it was when they convicted Marie Lafarge in the 40s. "If you say so," said Lawrence, feeling out of his depth. "I'll tell you how it works if you like," said Gosling enthusiastically, reaching for a porcelain apparatus containing taps and tubes. He placed the device on top of a wooden table and carefully adjusted it. "We need one of these," he said, unscrewing a jar. He reached for a small pair of tongs and extracted an even smaller piece of metal, which he placed in one arm of the tube. "What is that?" asked Lawrence. "Zinc," said Gosling, "and this is sulphuric acid." He pointed to a cabinet, donned a pair of heavy gloves, and poured in the contents of the bottle. "Now, let's take a sample from your jug," he continued, decanting a small amount into the other arm. "One stopper," he said, producing a rubber bung, "and a short wait." He stepped back and stared at the device. "It doesn't seem to be doing much," said Lawrence. "That's because you can't see through the porcelain," said the chemist. "But rest assured that hydrogen is now building up in the short arm." He made a vague gesture towards the apparatus. "Water?" "Where?" "I mean, would you like a glass of water, as you were unable to drink yours earlier?" Lawrence faltered, unsure whether to accept, given his recent experience. "It's perfectly safe." "Yes, then," Lawrence muttered, feeling foolish. Thomas Gosling poured a glass and smiled as he passed it to Lawrence. "Thank you," said Lawrence, gulping it down. A clock chimed from outside the room, and the chemist looked up. "Is that the time? I must get on," he said. "Now for the clever bit." He struck a match, released a nozzle on the device, and ignited the gas. Then he opened a small drawer beneath the desk, took out a piece of glass, and placed it in the whitish flame. "Oh dear," he sighed as a brownish-black spot appeared. "Your suspicions were correct. There was arsenic in your water." By the time Lawrence returned to the Crown, the full implications of his narrow escape had set in. His fingers shook as he untied his cravat, and he sat down slowly on the bed, thankful for the stray hair that had saved his life. By rights, Lawrence should have slept at the Crown the previous night, and was in the habit of drinking water if woken up in the small hours. Had the arsenic been introduced before bedtime, which was likely, he could have gulped it down without seeing the contents. Lawrence shuddered at the thought of death by poison. He'd already witnessed the unendurable pain of a strychnine victim, and would never forget seeing the dying spasms of the poisoner's target during one of his first cases as a newly promoted inspector. The memory would haunt him forever. He bolstered his pillows and lay back, reclining against the bedstead while surveying the hotel room. The bedroom door was to his right, and easily visible from the bed. It would be too risky for someone to interfere with his drinking water at night when he would be in the room. An intruder would be easy to see. In any case, he remembered drinking from the glass yesterday morning. The contamination must have occurred in the afternoon or early evening. It was most likely after he announced his suspicions to the Oddfellows, which implied their involvement. Equally, a member of the Panks family or their servants could have doctored his water. The keys were available from the recessed area of the hallway, and the front door to the Crown was open from early morning to late evening.
Anyone could have walked in off the street, which opened up the possibility of further suspects. While musing upon that thought, Lawrence fell asleep. He awoke to a pang of hunger, and his stomach growled in response. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and if he didn't shake a leg, he would miss dinner too. Lawrence stood and walked towards the dressing table where he picked up a comb and ran it through his hair. His reflection stared back, and he didn't like what he saw. The spray of grey at his temples had extended towards his ears. Faint vertical lines on his forehead suggested a perpetually worried man. He raised his eyebrows and watched the lines disappear, wishing that the change was permanent. It had been several months since he had last called upon his barber, and his hair needed a good cut. All in all, he did not feel his usual impeccably groomed self. As he turned away from the mirror, he spied a glint of metal on the floorboards near the bed. Lawrence peered more closely in case he had imagined it, but there was something on the floor. He walked towards the bed and stooped down, closing his hand over the object. Adrenaline coursed through his body as he opened his hand. In his palm was an object which looked like a chunk of metal, but was a cufflink with a symbol etched on top. The last time Lawrence had seen a similar symbol was inside the cupboard at the back of the Crown Hotel. It was a close match to one of the medallions from what he remembered, but Lawrence was by no means certain. He would have to go back and check, which might prove difficult in the middle of the evening. Patience was not his strongest virtue, but he was going to have to wait. In the meantime, he was starving. Gritting his teeth in frustration, Lawrence made his way to the dining room. Dinner was not a memorable meal, and Lawrence would have struggled to describe what he had eaten if asked. His concentration was lacking, and impatience overrode every other emotion as he waited for the evening to pass. Lawrence wasted an hour walking the streets, and at 10 o'clock returned to his room, making an unsuccessful attempt to sleep on top of the bedclothes. Eventually he gave up and decided it was late enough to risk a visit downstairs. The hallway was empty and the doors to the public areas shut, so he slunk towards the counter and removed the bunch of keys. The back of the Crown was dark and still. Lawrence located the lantern that he had borrowed on his earlier walk and stowed by the rear door. He ignited it and made for the cupboard again, encountering no one this time, feline or human. Once again the cupboard door opened easily, and this time the lantern cast a powerful illumination over the contents of the closet. Lawrence located the Oddfellow's jewels on the middle shelf where he had last seen the symbol. The little pile gleamed in the beam of the lantern as he compared them to the cufflink. He had been right. One of the icons was identical, but something beneath the jewels was different. Propped up against the shelf immediately below was a burlap sack tied with a rough rope that he did not recognize. Lawrence stared at it, trying to remember, but the bag occupied the spot on which he had spilt wax, so it could not have been there the night before. Lawrence untied the rope and pulled out the contents. First he retrieved a dark grey jacket in reasonable condition for a garment of its kind. Then he rummaged inside again and removed a flat cap and a pair of trousers. A halfpenny fell out of the trouser pocket, startling Lawrence as it rolled across the floor. Something white protruded from the other trouser pocket. Inch by inch, he tugged at it until he was holding what looked like a small furry animal. He held it aloft and saw an all-too-familiar wire and spring arrangement. The object he held was a long, full, white beard. Suddenly he realized what he was seeing. The outfit and beard fitted the description that William Miller had given of the man by Moyse's bookstall, the man who had asked him to find the Bible and who was responsible for many deaths, the man who had come perilously close to poisoning Lawrence earlier that day. He dropped the disguise and turned the sack inside out. There, at the bottom,
was a bundle of invoices bearing the mark of Aldrich's auctioneers. With shaking hands, Lawrence replaced the clothes and papers in the sack and set off for the police station. Chapter 39. A Mysterious Note. Tuesday, May 28th, 1895. Lawrence whistled as he descended the stairs of the Crown Hotel for the second time that morning. He delivered the burlap sack to the police house late on Monday night, anticipating a lacklustre response. Instead, the constable had listened intently. Mr. Gosling, the chemist, had been summoned to the police house shortly after breakfast to give an account of the Marsh test conducted the previous day. Then the constable had sent for his inspector, who regarded the sack solemnly, promising to question Harry Aldrich at the earliest opportunity. Lawrence had only given scant details of his suspicions. The facts surrounding the Burial Club deaths were too disorderly to make public, but he was making progress. As soon as he gained irrefutable proof of financial wrongdoing, he would present the evidence to the authorities. Lawrence decided to spend the rest of the day cross-referencing his records. As he reached the foot of the stairs, the formidable shape of George Panks loomed before him. The worst of his embarrassment about the late-night feeding foray had passed, and Lawrence greeted him with a cheery hello. Panks scowled. "When are you leaving?" he growled. "I haven't decided," said Lawrence, taken aback at the man's tone. George Panks' attitude had changed from the tolerance of a simpleton to outright hostility. "I suggest you decide soon," he said. "You are not welcome here." "Why?" asked Lawrence, perplexed. He wasn't sure he had caused any further offence to his host since the affair with the pie. "The arrest of Harry Aldrich this morning is why. The poor fellow is in the police house because of some cock-and-bull story that you cooked up. Aldrich is a good man, Harpham, and a good customer of this hotel." "So it's about money, is it?" asked Lawrence. "Worried there might not be any more meetings held here? Is that why you risked the life of one of your guests?" "What are you talking about?" "Poison," said Lawrence. "I don't know who you've been speaking to, but I was nearly killed in your hotel yesterday. I've since found incriminating evidence of Harry Aldrich's involvement. So I suggest you consider your position before condemning mine." George Panks continued to glare at Lawrence, but stepped away and allowed him to pass. As Lawrence made for the front door, Minnie Panks breezed past, oblivious to her father's mood. "I've got a letter for you, Mr. Harpham," she said, bustling towards the counter. "I would have delivered it earlier, but Father sent me to the butcher's and I clean forgot. Here." She thrust 2 envelopes towards him. "Ah, a telegram from Violet," he said, looking at the markings on the envelope. "Hello, what's this?" The second envelope was white and written in a chunky, almost childish hand with the words "Private and Confidential" inscribed at the top. Intrigued, Lawrence slipped Violet's telegram into his trouser pocket and slit open the envelope. He read the slip of paper inside. "Come to the reading rooms at the Dis Express as soon as you receive my note." Lawrence turned the page over. The reverse was blank. "Who gave you this?" he said, showing it to Minnie. "Nobody," she replied, not troubling to read the page. "I found it on the doorstep this morning." "When?" "About 7 o'clock. He said vaguely, reaching for the door, not sure what to make of the letter. He supposed that it must have come from young Charles, the compositor. But quite what he wanted with Lawrence was a mystery. If the message had been for Violet, he would have understood. Charles had taken quite a shine to her since her help with his handwriting problems, but the letter was explicitly intended for Lawrence, and therefore a puzzle. Lawrence hastened straight for the printworks, and was there within 10 minutes, hoping it was not another waste of his time. He was keen to get back to his notes and produce a timeline of evidence that might satisfy the constabulary. He pushed the wooden door, but it did not open. Turning the handle did not remedy the problem, and it was clear that the door was locked. Lawrence walked down the side of the building and to the rear, where he remembered seeing another door on his previous visit. Sure enough, he could tell from a distance that the rear door was ajar.
He pushed it open and walked inside. The small rear lobby led to the open door of the reading room. Lawrence peered inside, but the room was empty. He went to the front of the building, through the compositor's office and into the entrance with the long counter. The printworks were bafflingly devoid of human life. He returned to the rear again, wondering whether he was being taken for a fool by the letter writer. It could be a punishment for his part in the arrest of Harry Aldrich. After all, Harry was one of the town's most esteemed inhabitants. Lawrence was only too aware of the strength of feeling against him from his earlier encounter with Panks. He returned to the reading room, deciding to use his time wisely by consulting the archived newspapers while the place was empty. But as he glanced across the room, his eye was drawn towards another envelope. It had been propped up against a book in the middle of the table and marked Private. On the front of the envelope, written in a familiar childish scrawl, was, "For the attention of Lawrence Harpham." Chapter 40. Derailed. Monday, May 27th, 1895. The train journey that should have taken Violet no more than 4 hours had begun badly and rapidly turned into the worst travel experience of her life. The steam engine had pulled out of Dis station and gone no more than a few miles before grinding to a halt on the tracks. After a long delay, a harassed conductor informed the passengers that the boiler was faulty and would need repairing. Another hour passed before they were finally underway. The engine limped on a while longer until they reached the outskirts of Norwich. Then disaster struck as an explosion ripped through the front of the train. Time stood still. The windows imploded from the force of the blast, and shards of glass spiked across the forwardmost carriages. Violet joined the other passengers as they scrambled onto the tracks in a disorderly mass. Outside, the scene was chaotic. 2 boilermen, dragged from the front of the train by their colleagues, lay bleeding on the grass. Another man, slumped by the side of the locomotive, was beyond help. The engine lay broken and still, pipes and metal spilling from the front of the boiler. A young mother sobbed frantically, and her frightened children huddled by her side while an elderly lady tried to console them. The woman continued screaming, caught in an unending cycle of hysteria, until a wiry, dark-haired man slapped her on the cheek. "How dare you, sir?" bellowed a white-moustached man in colonial attire. The young man ignored him and shook his head before kneeling by one of the injured boilermen. He cradled the man's head and made a clumsy attempt to dress his wounds, working in silence. The slap had done the trick, and the young woman had stopped crying. She rocked backwards and forwards on a grassy mound, arms cradled around her children. Their sobs quietened as they leaned into their mother. Violet joined the young man and offered her help. He nodded his acceptance, and she explained that she was an experienced first aider. He introduced himself as Morris. One of the fallen boilermen had suffered a deep gash to his upper arm from which blood spurted in a pulsing stream. Violet asked Morris to remove his belt to use as a tourniquet. He unbuckled it without speaking, and Violet applied it to the injured arm. The bleeding slowed to a trickle, and the boilerman's complexion gradually changed from grey to pink. Violet loosened his shirt and made a thorough check. He'd suffered cuts and bruises from the flying metal, but was not in any immediate danger. His companion had been less fortunate. Though initially seeming in better health, he was now flagging. He'd walked from the train unaided, according to Morris, and had appeared uninjured, but now he breathed in rasping gulps, and beads of sweat dotted his brow. Violet felt for his pulse. It was slow. She rested her head on his chest and listened to his rattling lungs. "This man needs urgent medical help," she whispered. "I'll go," said Morris, and he set off towards a hamlet in the distance. Violet was still sitting next to the boiler man an hour later. As dusk had fallen, the temperature dropped. The injured man clung to her hand as his body shivered in shock. Some passengers had taken their chances and made for the hamlet, but Violet remained with the stricken men. She was not alone. The train crew had stayed behind, helping anyone unable to walk, including elderly passengers, a middle-aged man with a walking stick, and 2 young children. Pins and needles spiked through Violet's legs, which she feared would turn to cramp. Just when she thought she would have to get up and walk around to relieve the discomfort, she saw the glow of lanterns in the distance. Moments later, Morris appeared with 2 other men. "Help is coming," he said. "There will be enough carts to take you to Norwich." He was as good as his word, and the transport arrived within moments. The injured went first, and Violet rode with them, staying until they arrived at the hospital. She watched as medical staff assisted them into the emergency wards, wondering what she would do for a bed. But as she walked away, a nurse ran up to her and guided her back into the hospital, where she gave her a thorough examination. Typically, Violet had given no thought to herself. At first, Violet had protested but realized that she would be less of a nuisance if she agreed, and when the nurse removed her coat, there were swathes of dried blood on her dress. Violet had sustained wounds of her own and not noticed the pain in her bid to aid the more seriously injured. The nurse dressed her cuts and grazes, then offered Violet a bed. Both knew it was not necessary, but Violet would be comfortable on the ward, even if only for a few hours. As it happened, she didn't leave until the next morning. Tuesday, May 28th, 1895. Violet located her luggage at Norwich Station, where her rescuers had left it the previous night. It was still early when she boarded the Cromer train. The trip was quicker and safer than the journey from Diss, and she pulled into the station well before lunchtime, taking her carpet bag while leaving her suitcase in the conductor's care. Violet continued the short trip to Overstrand by carriage as the sun blazed high in the sky on a perfect May day. She walked to the centre of the village, pondering whether to stay or return to Bury on the evening train. Violet strolled down the high street, intending to go to the Cottons' house on Gunton Terrace, but determined to make the most of the balmy weather, she took a detour instead. Turning into the lawns, she walked past the Flint cottages, stopping to peer through an ornate wooden gate where vibrant violet wisteria crowded the wall. The pretty gardens burgeoned with spring flowers. At the end of Paul's Lane, she saw a fisherman crouching by a net at the top of the cliff with a large-eyed needle in his hand. Beside him was a wooden bucket containing seawater in which freshly caught crabs clawed at the surface. A second bucket contained the still bodies of previously boiled crustaceans. Violet asked the fisherman if he would mind her bag, and he nodded his assent. She left it by the side of the buckets, free to explore the beach without the burden of luggage. Violet removed her shoes and stockings and made her way across the sand, avoiding the pebbles. The tide was halfway out, leaving little pools of seaweed and shellfish in its wake. Violet walked to the water's edge, letting the sea lap against her ankles, and inhaled the salty odour. Her senses were alive with the sound and smell of the sea, yesterday's accident already a distant memory. Life was transient, she thought, easily lost. It took an experience like the train explosion to appreciate life and the good health she enjoyed. Violet paddled for 10 minutes, then found a dry spot towards the cliffs and let her feet dry in the sun. Brushing the sand from her toes, she put her shoes on and headed back. By the time Violet climbed to the top, the fisherman had repaired his net and was dressing crabs on a little wooden trestle table. She retrieved her suitcase, and the fisherman suggested she might enjoy a small crab for lunch. Violet accepted gratefully, remembering how much she'd enjoyed them during her stay with Lord and Lady Battersea. She located a nearby seat and began to eat the crab, but a wave of nausea came from nowhere, and she could not finish. Disappointed, Violet left the uneaten crab by the side of the path where seagulls soon disposed of it. With a churning stomach, She returned up Paul's Lane and towards Gunton Terrace. Amelia Cotton was sweeping the pathway outside number 4 when Violet approached. She regarded Violet quizzically before recognition dawned, and she greeted her warmly. They exchanged small talk, and Violet began the tricky task of explaining the purpose of her visit. "So, are you suggesting that my father's Bible belonged to a murderer?" asked Amelia, misunderstanding the Bible's provenance. "No," said Violet. "The man who sold it was the victim. Someone killed him. After my father received the Bible. Yes. A few months later." "But what has it got to do with father?" "Nothing," said Violet. "It is a coincidence. But I have reason to believe that the Bible might contain a document which the murderer went to great lengths to recover." "Father never spoke of any such thing," said Amelia doubtfully. "He may not have understood the significance. Have you kept the Bible?" asked Violet. "I have, as it happens," said Amelia. "Mother gave it to my husband, George, as a keepsake. May I see it? If you wish." Violet followed Amelia into her kitchen and waited at the table while the younger woman went upstairs. She returned with the Bible and set it down on the table, anxiously hovering as Violet opened the front page. The bookstall stamp and inscription were as Violet remembered. She flicked through the pages of the black-bound book, checking for a letter or document, but the Bible was empty. She turned to the final page, checked the binding and pressed the cover. The lining was intact and undisturbed. "I didn't think you would find anything," said Amelia. "If there ever was a letter, it is long gone." Violet put the book on the table, trying not to feel too deflated. She'd known that finding the confession was an unlikely prospect, but one worth checking. "Thank you anyway," said Violet. "It was kind, especially as—" Violet stopped in her tracks as she glanced at the Bible again. There was one place she hadn't yet checked. She stood the book on end and scrutinized the spine. The cover fitted neatly around the pages with no visible gap. Violet splayed it open, and the space between the spine and cover gaped just enough for her to insert the tip of her index finger. She could feel a slight difference in the lining of the spine and dragged her nail along the inside. Something moved, and she tried again, inching an object up the spine until the tip of a curved piece of paper emerged. "What is it?" asked Amelia, eyes wide. Violet pinched the tube of paper and pulled it out, unfurling the document across the table. "Oh, no," she said, colour draining from her face. "It can't be." "Can't be what?" asked Amelia, but Violet was already rushing out of the door. Time was short, and she had an urgent telegram to send before the post office closed. Chapter 41. At Musket Staithe. Lawrence picked up the envelope and examined it. The anonymity of the writing evoked the stomach-churning memories he'd felt when he'd received Catherine's crests. But whatever the envelope contained, it couldn't be that. Nobody from Bury St. Edmunds knew that he was working in Diss. Well, nobody apart from his domestic, Annie, who he trusted implicitly. There were no further clues on the back of the envelope, and he opened it gingerly, revealing a newspaper cutting dated December 8th, 1877. The clipping was from the Bury Free Press and detailed Fanny Nunn's inquest. The article was familiar. Lawrence had already seen it during his research, but the snippet in his hand was a fraction of the original piece, and someone had underlined a paragraph in blue ink. It read, "There's £30 of money in this little bag. You will find it in my Ulster coat pocket tomorrow morning 20 yards from Mr. Musket Staithe in the mere under the weeping willow." Carefully written beneath in the same childish writing as the original note was the figure 9. It was drawn next to a depiction of a clock face with a half-moon scribbled below. Lawrence sighed as he leaned against the table with the note in his hand. The whole thing left him feeling like a participant in a parlour game,
The picture was an unsubtle clue to time, and the presence of the moon indicated that he should be somewhere at 9 o'clock at night. Judging by the reference to Mr. Muskett's staith, it was an instruction to meet underneath the willow tree at the appointed hour. But it was silly and dramatic, like a theatre performance, and not a very good one at that. Lawrence felt too old to participate in a purposeless charade, and yet he was still curious. What might he find there? And would it be a risk if he didn't arrive at the requested hour? He mulled it over for another 10 minutes, vacillating between obeying instructions or ignoring the note. If he decided to go, should he take a companion or set off alone? He even contemplated asking for Michael's opinion, but the long walk to Friends' Church deterred him, not to mention the embarrassment of Michael knowing he had given credence to the note. In the end, curiosity got the better of reason, and he decided to go by himself. The risks were low. It would still be light at 9 o'clock, and he had no cause for concern about his safety now that Harry Aldrich was in police custody. Making the decision made him feel more comfortable, and he left the Printworks for the Crown Hotel. Once there, he spent the rest of the day arranging records. Satisfied with his progress and confident that he could prove his suspicions, he broke for supper. Then, finding it unusually quiet, he read the paper in the lounge until 9:15. Earlier that day, it had occurred to Lawrence that he had no idea where to find Mr. Muskett's staith. As usual, he broached the subject with Minnie Panks, and obligingly she not only shared the location but told him what a staith was, without him having to go through the indignity of asking. Feeling better prepared, Lawrence set off towards the mere, looking out for a large willow tree near to Muskett's landing stage. He saw it as soon as he approached the mere, and as Lawrence drew closer, it was apparent that the rickety structure required repair. Lawrence loitered beneath the willow and ran a hand over its ancient bark. Shrouded within its golden-leaved boughs, he realized that he was almost invisible to anyone passing. Whoever had summoned him here must have understood the cloaking effect of the willow, and thus hoped for privacy. The thought made Lawrence nervous, and he walked towards the water's edge and picked up a small rock, which he placed in his pocket for protection. 9 o'clock came and went, and nobody appeared, and at 5 minutes past the hour, Lawrence wandered away from the mere. As he reached the footpath, he almost collided with Joseph Pope, Arthur Thompson, and George Fairweather.
"Good evening,"
said Joseph.
"Which of us are you arranging to arrest today?"
It wasn't like that, sighed Lawrence. He hadn't expected anyone to welcome him with open arms, but the overt hostility came as a surprise. George Fairweather glared at him.
"I'm going," he growled. "The air smells bad around here."
He stalked off without looking back. Joseph Pope tipped his hat and forced a smile.
"Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said sarcastically. "Are you joining me, Arthur?"
"Later," said Arthur, holding his hand up. He waited until the men were distant shadows. "Sorry," he shrugged. "They are still upset about Harry." "But you're not?" asked Lawrence. "Only because I'm sure that he will soon be a free man. I don't hold you entirely responsible," he continued. "Are the fish biting well?" "I beg your pardon?" "It's 9:10 and getting dark," he said, snapping open his pocket watch. "Why else would you be by the mere?" His question caught Lawrence off guard. "I'm waiting for someone," he said without thinking. "I'll keep you company if you like." "No." Lawrence immediately regretted the force of his refusal and the suspicion it might generate. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure." "Pity," said Arthur. "I've nothing better to do." Lawrence watched him stride away, waiting until he was sure that he was alone. Then he returned to his place beneath the willow, deciding to wait for another half an hour before giving it up as a bad job. A slight breeze rustled through the leaves as he stood in semi-darkness, concealed from the sight of any passer-by. Gently lapping water punctuated the silence, and Lawrence shifted his weight from one leg to the other as the evening cooled. A branch snapped underfoot as Lawrence eased towards the edge of the willow, then another, until enlightenment dawned. Lawrence was standing on grass. So why could he hear footsteps? The sound was coming from someone else. He tensed, barely breathing, listening for a clue to the direction of the noise. But the only sound was the high-pitched yowl of a passing fox. He must be hearing things. The failing light was making him nervous, and he was getting cold. He decided to give it another 5 minutes, then retreat to the Crown for a quick bedtime brandy. His mouth watered at the thought. Lawrence pulled his collar up and thrust his hands into his pockets, his fingers connected with Violet's telegram, discarded earlier in his haste to identify the letter-writer. He retrieved it and opened the envelope, straining to read in the poor light. It was no good. The words swam in a blurry mess on the page. He patted his inner pocket and found the tin he always carried containing a candle stub and matches. Then he struck a match, lit the candle, and examined the telegram. It was a brief and concise warning. And as the words registered in his mind, Lawrence heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind him. He had no time to draw breath, let alone move, before he felt the cold metal edge of a knife against his neck. Chapter 42. Unmasked.
"I wouldn't move if I were you," said a familiar voice as the sharp-bladed weapon pressed into his carotid artery. "I wasn't planning to," Lawrence retorted. "I suppose you recognize my voice." "Yes, it's quite distinctive." "Are you going to tell me the point of this charade?" Lawrence winced as the knife dug deeper, and he felt a drop of blood well against the blade and trickle down his neck. "Careful. This waistcoat is new."
"Then I would say that you wasted your money,"
said his assailant, chuckling at the play on words. "Are you going to tell me why we are here?"
"If that's how you want to spend the last few minutes of your life, then by all means. What would you like to know?"
"Let's start with Amy Sullivan, shall we? What was she to you?"
"Amy Sullivan."
The man sighed wistfully as he drawled her name in elongated vowels.
"What a woman."
"But you never married her."
"Why would I? I didn't love her."
"Yet she loved you."
"You probably find that difficult to understand. I was a handsome young buck in my day. Amy's adoration was useful. But I didn't need a wife. I needed a partner."
"Partner in crime?"
"Precisely."
"And it was all about money."
"Now, Harpham, that's rather offensive. The money was a useful extra, but it was all about power."
Lawrence snorted. "Power!" he exclaimed, momentarily forgetting the knife against his throat. "You killed women and children. They were easy targets."
"Not power in the crude way you describe. And I killed full-grown men, too. It was about possessing the power of life or death."
Lawrence shuddered at the excitement in his captor's voice, betraying naked passion at the thought of murder.
"Have you ever seen anyone drown?"
The man closed his eyes, as if accessing a favorite memory.
"The pleasure of watching is exquisite. But nothing surpasses the act. I can make the end quick, or prolong it indefinitely. The power, the thrill."
"But why?"
"Because I like it."
"And Fanny Nunn? Was she just another victim?" asked Lawrence, discreetly sliding his hands in his pockets.
"Fanny Nunn was an interfering busybody," hissed the man, always poking her nose into matters that did not concern her.
"Tell me more." The man expelled a sigh, and Lawrence recoiled at the warm breath as it brushed the back of his neck.
"Sit down,"
the man commanded. Lawrence lowered himself to a seated position beneath the willow and looked up at his assailant. "Won't you join me?" he asked.
"Hardly,"
said the man, running his thumb along the edge of the knife. Move so much as a finger, and I will cut your tongue out. Stay still, and I'll tell you a story." Lawrence sat quietly and waited for the man to begin. "My mother killed my father," said Joseph Pope casually. "And I was quite happy to go along with it. We were poor, you see, had nothing. Father was sick and didn't work. He was a useless waster. I was 16 when father died. Mother and I discussed it first, both agreeing that my meagre income could support 2 of us, but not 3. Father was 10 years older than she, and as weak as a kitten by the time we killed him. He didn't struggle when she put the pillow over his head. Nobody questioned his death, nobody cared. And then we remembered that he had been paying into the burial club. Not only did my earnings go further, but we received a little more than the cost of the funeral. It was a good Christmas that year. For once, there was food on the table." Joseph paced as he spoke, keeping a watchful eye above Lawrence's head. "The following year, Mother had a fall. She lingered for a week, then died. A terrible accident, they said. It wasn't anything of the kind. I pushed her down the stairs. Fortunately, she never regained consciousness. Waiting until 13 months after Father's death gave me time to pay a year's worth of insurance premiums on her life. It was a much better return on investment than the pitiful offerings of the burial club. Then I met Amy." "How?" "She nursed my mother in her final weeks," said Joseph. "Amy was lonely and liked to talk, which was irritating to begin with, until I realized how useful her village tittle-tattle could be. One day she told me that Hannah Rampling had been complaining about her sick child, wishing that it would die so she could have the burial club money. Amy deplored her sentiments, but all I could see was the flaw in her logic. Hannah Rampling wouldn't get the money, you see. Children under 8 are uninsurable. But it put me in mind of a scheme for use outside the confines of the burial club payments, so I insured the life of a sick child. I had no relationship with the boy. He belonged to one of the parishioners, but the insurer accepted me as the parent, and I waited for him to die. The child had a wasting disease and did not take long to succumb. The insurers asked a few questions, and I profited handsomely. But Amy discovered the insurance papers and started to pry." "I'm surprised you didn't kill her too," said Lawrence, staring at Pope from his seated position. Joseph's lip curled. "Why would I kill her when she could be useful? No. I courted her and made love to her until she became devoted to me. I gave her little gifts from my profits. She did not mind the deception when it only amounted to fraud. But that did not last. No, there are only so many times one can fool an insurance company. In any case, sickness is unreliable. Illness does not always lead to death, and when it does, the timing may not work. As it happened, a solution arrived, courtesy of Amy, who had been speaking to Hannah Rampling again. Hannah had too many children to feed and wasn't attached to any of them. I asked Amy to suggest to her that the demise of one might be to the advantage of the rest. At first, Amy balked at the scheme, so I withdrew my affections. Within a week, she'd come crawling back, prepared to do my bidding. Amy agreed to act as my agent in the strictest confidence, never revealing my involvement, and under my guidance, she encouraged Hannah to invest a little money into the burial club. 9 months later, she had paid enough to guarantee death benefits, and we set to work on the second part of the plan, which was the death of one of her children, of course. She chose one of her sons. He was not a pleasant child, though it would not have mattered if he was, but Billy Rampling was particularly obnoxious. He was rude, foul-mouthed, and the sort of boy who pulled wings off flies for fun. His mother sent him down to the river on Amy's instructions, and I killed him there. His death was the first at my hands since Mother, and the most satisfying. Nothing has ever compared to the thrill of holding him under the water and watching the air bubbles disperse, the shudder of his final breath, the moment that life became extinct. The power of it, Harpham, the sheer, unadulterated power.
Steady on, said Lawrence sarcastically. Pope frowned at the interruption to his recollections.
You will soon find out what it's like to be on the other end of that power, he snapped. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. The Rampling child. I left him in the river, and they found him later that day. The surgeon examined him and declared him drowned. His mother had the burial club money, as planned, with a bit for me and a bit for Amy. And that's how it began, a combination of insurance and burial club frauds. Sometimes with the cooperation of the parent or the spouse, and sometimes on my own initiative. It has been very lucrative, Harpham.
And nobody ever knew?
No. Amy was a nurse with easy access to the weak and vulnerable, none of whom knew about me. Well, not until that interfering creature Fanny Nunn stuck her nose in.
So she was blackmailing you? Had he not been in fear of his life, Lawrence would have relished the thought. He and Violet had guessed as much.
I was discussing a proposition with Amy one day which Fanny Nunn overheard, said Joseph. Fortunately, I was standing in the lee of the building and she could not see me. She heard the conversation and saw Amy, but didn't understand the consequences of what she had witnessed at the time. Later they found old man Good in the hay barn with his head smashed in, and she remembered the conversation and understood our intentions.
His death was not an accident, then?
Quite the contrary. I fully intended to smother Good, but he fell from the hayloft and hit his head on the stone step. It looked exactly like an accident to anyone except Fanny Nunn, who had heard us discussing Good earlier. Luckily, she was greedy and resorted to blackmail instead of telling the authorities. She visited Amy and asked for £30. We could easily have spared it, but she would have always been there, waiting for another opportunity to make money. She had to go. Amy summoned her to the Staithe to collect her ill-gotten gains, and I tossed her into the mere, knowing that she could not swim.
Nobody saw you?
Not a soul. It has always been that way. Nobody knew of my involvement. Nobody even guessed that the deaths were anything other than natural. I am just Joseph, large and jovial, a friend to all. Even if the good people of Dis knew there was a murderer in their midst, I am the last person they would suspect, which is why I won't get caught when I kill you.
What makes you think I haven't told someone where to find me?
I made you wait, didn't I? There was a reason for that. Passing with Fairweather and Thompson allowed me to watch you. Of course, I didn't expect you to leave your position under the willow. I picked it precisely to hide you from view. And the quick chat established that nobody else was nearby. I caught up with Fairweather, waited for Thompson, and entered my house while they watched before doubling back. All in 10 minutes. And leaving me with an excellent alibi.
Tell me about Moyes, said Lawrence, ignoring the glee in Joseph Pope's voice.
Ah, yes. A far greater problem than Fanny Nunn, it turned out, but Providence has always smiled upon me. Moyes had a secret. A secret that did not endear him to his brother-in-law. I don't even know what it was, but it didn't matter. William Jackson was intolerant of anything that Moyes had to say. He received a letter about Amy's blasted confession to which he cannot have attached any credence. I know this because he screwed it up in a ball which fortuitously dropped to the floor of the Crown Hotel as I was passing. I shudder to think what would have happened if it had fallen into the wrong hands. I needed to act quickly.
And you went to Liverpool?
I did, but not on impulse. I pondered the matter overnight, weighing up the risk and considering if there was an alternative course of action. There was none. The man was a danger, and disposal of the confession was essential. So you went to Liverpool in disguise. As you found out, it was quite a shock when I realized that you knew. I don't recall talking about it. You didn't. I found a journal in your room. I was always going to introduce arsenic into your water, but the act gave me even greater pleasure once I read through your notes and realized the extent of your knowledge. You had accumulated an alarming amount of information, including reference to my disguise. How did you do it? Do what? Doctor my water with arsenic. It's necessary to sign a poison register, and even then, chemists colour the poison. There was the barest trace of sediment in the glass. I nearly missed it. The arsenic came from an old tin of rat poison, said Joseph Pope. It has been in my possession for many years, and is as effective now as it ever was. I use it sparingly, though, he continued. Varied murders are less likely to look suspicious. Returning to Moyes, said Lawrence, I don't understand why he died. Neither do I, to be frank. In hindsight, it was the perfect solution to my problem, but I did not set off to harm Moyes. There was no danger to me without Amy's confession. Nobody knew who had written it. It was clear that she had not named me, and if she had signed it, it would have been evident in the letter that Jackson received. But I did not know if there were any other means of identification within the confession, and if Moyes returned to Diss one day with the letter, there was a chance that someone might recognize the handwriting. My sole intention was to locate the letter and destroy it, and I employed Miller for that purpose. How he made such a meal of it, I cannot imagine. Frustration and panic, said Lawrence. He could not locate the confession nor the Bible in which it lay. He didn't look hard enough. Moyes kept his book stock at his dwelling. I questioned one of his boys. You overlooked one thing, though. What? He ran a bookstall, the sole purpose of which was to make money, and he'd sold the Bible. It wasn't there to find. I don't believe it, Joseph Pope spluttered with incredulity. Why would he sell the very book that contained the confession he was so disturbed about finding? I doubt very much that he did. Books littered his house, and he employed several assistants at the bookstall, all of whom had access. He may not have even been aware that it was missing. How do you know? Joseph spat the words angrily. Lawrence considered his reply. Joseph Pope was a cold-blooded, conscienceless killer from whom he would be lucky to escape. If he said too much, it might implicate Violet, and if he saw the telegram in his pocket, it would cement her fate. You'll never know, he said coldly with a recalcitrant expression on his face. Tell me. Pope knelt behind Lawrence and pulled his head back by his hair, tracing the blade of his knife down Lawrence's thorax. Lawrence clenched his fists, trying to prevent his body from shaking too hard. Sweat ran in rivulets down his temples. He was starting to panic about his weak position and vulnerability to the whims of a multiple murderer. I said, tell me, hissed Pope, or I will cut you. He moved the knife up to Lawrence's face and placed the tip at the top of his cheek. An eye or your tongue? He asked. Choose. Lawrence slowly unclenched his right fist as another drop of sweat trickled from his brow. His hand moved undetected towards his coat pocket. Eye or tongue? Eye or tongue? Said Pope in a sing-song voice as he moved the knife from cheek to lip, all the time pulling Lawrence's hair tighter with his free hand. Oops! Slipped, said Pope, as the knife cut the skin between Lawrence's lip and nose. A trickle of blood seeped into his mouth. Lawrence licked his lips, feeling sick at the metallic taste. But it focused his mind.
Lawrence Pope was going to kill him, and if he didn't act soon, it would be too late. In one swift move, he plunged his hand into his coat pocket, grabbed the rock he had collected earlier, and thrust his hand behind his shoulder, connecting with Pope's jawbone. Pope howled in pain and dropped the knife. Lawrence rolled to one side, searching for Pope in the shadows as he scrambled to his feet. Daylight was long gone, but he could see the dim outline of Pope a few yards ahead of him. The portly killer was on one knee, clutching his head. A twig snapped as Lawrence moved forward, and Pope jerked his head up, piggy eyes meeting Lawrence's stare. He snatched at something on the ground before him, and Lawrence held back, realizing that Pope had located the fallen knife. Joseph Pope got unsteadily to his feet, holding the blade in front. He waved it towards Lawrence. "Don't be a fool," snarled Lawrence. "I can outrun you. Put the knife down." "All right," said Pope, placing the knife on the ground directly in front. "Step away," commanded Lawrence. Pope took one pace backwards and waited. Lawrence moved forwards uncertainly, suspicious at the speed of Pope's capitulation. But Pope was a safe distance away, and Lawrence knew he had time to swoop for the knife, even if the killer came at him. But as Lawrence knelt and reached out, he felt a crack against his temple and dropped to his knees. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the same bloodied rock he'd used on Pope a few minutes before. Chapter 43. Submerged. Lawrence woke to the sound of grunting as a noise like a truffle pig disturbed his slumber. His face was wet and cold, and a searing pain shot through his head. He shivered, wondering whether he was in the grip of a nightmare. Then the grunting started again, and he felt something brush against his face, something like grass. He inhaled a mossy smell and realized that he was close to the ground and his body was moving. Rough hands clutched his ankles, dragging him onto a muddy path as his arms followed uselessly behind. He coughed and inhaled a mouthful of dirt, then twisted his head to orientate himself. A pale moon hung high in the sky, illuminating a body of water to the front. It was the mere. He was inches from the riverbank. The grunting stopped, and his feet were released as a shape loomed ahead, kicking him over to face the night sky. Joseph Pope stood above him, brandishing the knife. "Ah, you're awake. Good," said Pope, a cruel smile etched across his face. "I would hate you to miss your death." Lawrence planted his hands behind him and tried to heave himself up. "No, you don't," hissed Pope. "Not this time." He took the knife and plunged it into Lawrence's forearm. Lawrence felt strangely detached from the scream that exploded from his chest, piercing the silent night. Pulling himself together, he sat up and lunged towards Pope with his uninjured arm. Pope grimaced, then aimed a boot at Lawrence, connecting with his stomach. Lawrence flailed, trying to catch his breath, but it wouldn't come. Gasping like a landed trout, he gulped at the air, but it was futile. Lawrence lay, winded, the air kicked from his lungs as Pope grabbed his ankles again, pulling him towards the water. As they reached the edge of the mere, Pope stepped to one side, kicked Lawrence until he lay horizontally along the bank, then rolled him into the water. As Lawrence felt the freezing liquid seep through his suit, he raised his head in shock and took a deep breath, finally inflating his lungs. But Pope was waiting. Standing on the edge, he raised his boot and slammed it onto Lawrence's skull. Lawrence thrashed beneath the water as Pope ground his face into the gravelly bottom. Sediment streamed down his throat and into his eyes, and his lungs screamed for air. He shook his head, but the water sapped his strength, and he could not escape Pope's hobnailed boot. He felt a bubble escape from his lips, then another. It was all over. He couldn't hang on. Just as the blackness began to overwhelm him, his head seemed to float weightlessly to the surface. The boot was gone. A pair of arms pulled him from the mere and dragged him to safety. "Hold on, Harpham," said a voice. Lawrence stared through blurry eyes. Suddenly, multiple lanterns illuminated the edge of the mere. "Out of the way!" Another man continued, pushing him to a seated position and slapping his back. He coughed as a lungful of water sloshed from his mouth. "Here," said a man he didn't recognize, covering him with a blanket.
"What happened?"
Lawrence croaked, recovering his faculties. "I heard you cry out," said a familiar voice. "I wasn't about to let you suffer the same fate as Fanny Nunn." Lawrence looked up into the concerned eyes of Harry Aldrich. "They've let you go?" Aldrich nodded. "Pope left evidence in your shop, I suppose?" "I expect so." "Where is he?" Lawrence looked around in alarm. "There." Harry Aldrich pointed to an object in the mere that looked like a floating log. "Is he dead?" Aldrich nodded. "I heard you cry out. Opened my window and saw you in the mere, just like I saw Fanny all those years ago. But I wasn't going to let the same thing happen again. I roused my neighbours, and we ran down to the water. Pope was standing there with a maniacal expression on his face. We pulled him off, but he ran towards Musket Staithe. The steps were rotten. He fell and hit his head on a post. Pope is dead, Mr. Harpham. Drowned. It is all over." Chapter 44. No Reprieve. Tuesday, June 4th, 1895. A clock ticked loudly in the premises of Harpham and Smith Private Investigators in Bury St. Edmunds. The occupants of the room stared wordlessly at the timepiece, barely breathing. They watched as the second hand circumvented the clock face twice, and both jumped when the clock chimed the hour. "That's it, then," said Lawrence Harpham, turning towards his companion, who occupied the desk to his side. Violet nodded. "I thought William Miller might get reprieved." "I didn't," said Lawrence. "Uncle Fred sent a telegram yesterday. He was not expecting leniency." "Do you think Miller saw his family before he died?" "I should think so," said Lawrence, looking at the clock again. "It's usually the way." Lawrence and Violet were in their office half an hour earlier than usual. Each had decided, without conferring, that they would mark the hour of William Miller's execution at their desks. On any less sombre occasion, seeing Violet for a few extra minutes would have pleased Lawrence no end. She had not been herself lately, disappearing at odd hours and looking sickly and pale. On several occasions, she had started to say something and stopped herself mid-flow. Recently they had spoken of little other than work-related matters, and he was beginning to think that he might have offended her. Yet Violet was still a source of considerable strength to him, especially the day before when another anonymous envelope had arrived. They both saw it at the same time, but Violet had snatched it from the doormat and set light to it, dropping the burning remains in the empty fireplace. Lawrence had protested, desperate to know what was under the sealed flap, but Violet had gently told him that it was the only way to save his sanity, and she'd been right. The letter had not blackened his mood, nor opened tender wounds. Catherine occupied a more modest part of his feelings, commensurate with her absence from his life. Violet, on the other hand, was beginning to take up an increasing number of his thoughts. His concern over her recent demeanour and insularity had caused him to request that she join him in the Abbey grounds at lunchtime. It was time he acknowledged her importance, and showed her how much he cared. Perhaps then she would feel able to confide in him. "Did you get the letters?" he asked, breaking from his reverie. Violet nodded. "They arrived last night. Please thank your uncle." "I will. Did you find anything worthwhile?" "Oh, yes, take a look at this." Violet handed Lawrence a long blue envelope affixed with a New Zealand postage stamp. Uncle Fred, an avid reader of the Liverpool Mercury, had seen notice of an auction to sell the effects of the late Edward Moyes. His nephew had kept most of his personal items, but Uncle Fred had purchased a small cabinet, inside which was a bundle of letters tied with string. "I've seen this before," said Lawrence, slipping one of the letters from the envelope. I recognise the name. He pointed to the neat signature at the bottom of the document. James Dunleavy wrote the majority of the letters, said Violet. They confirm what I suspected. Lawrence reread the message and felt none the wiser by the time he reached the end. He says he has had a successful trip and will return home within the month, said Lawrence. He trusts that Moyes is well and hopes that he is not lonely. The content is trivial. Violet passed him another letter. Try this one. Much of the same, said Lawrence. Idle chatter. Don't you find it rather intimate? Lawrence knitted his brow as he scrutinized the pages. It is somewhat, he conceded. Perhaps Dunleavy was a relative. Violet raised her eyebrow half an inch. You're not suggesting... She passed him another envelope, this time white and square. The Scole address was typewritten, and the letter inside bore the date, 1887. The formally written missive contained a thinly veiled warning from the Hobart branch of the Plymouth Brethren. Moyes should not approach the Norfolk Brethren sects who were now aware of his behaviour. The letter referenced a scandalous relationship and Moyes's subsequent voyage back to Blighty. Lawrence squirmed in his chair. I see, he managed. You see? Is that all? Why are you not angry at their treatment of him? Violet demanded. That poor man, he cannot help his feelings or choose who he loves. They destroyed his life when they banished him from New Zealand. Look through the rest of the letters when you get a chance, she continued. Before the incident, Moyes was a highly regarded evangelist. He made huge personal sacrifices to spread God's word. But not content to expel him from the Antipodes, these so-called men of God conspired to ruin his life in England. So the stranger who approached William Jackson was from New Zealand, or Tasmania. It could have been either, but yes. That is my best guess. William Jackson could not bear what his brother-in-law was, and sent him away. Poor Edward went to Liverpool, where nobody knew him, in the hope of privacy, so he could continue his life without scandal. Only to be murdered. Lawrence steepled his hands and considered the transience of life. We should make the most of every moment, he said, gazing towards Violet. She was unjudgmental and compassionate. What more could a man want in a partner? We need to talk, he said, voice brimming with emotion. As Violet opened her mouth to speak, the doorbell jangled, and an elegant young lady closed her parasol and came into the room. Lawrence turned hot and cold as he met Loveday's eyes. Are you pleased to see me? She gushed. We had such a lovely time in Liverpool that I thought I would look you up. Violet stared at Loveday open-mouthed, closing her eyes as if in pain. Swallowing hard, she got to her feet, cleared the letters from Lawrence's desk, and stowed them in her drawer. Nodding silently at Loveday, Violet left the office with her head bowed. Lawrence watched in stunned silence as she disappeared from the butter market and made her way towards the railway station. Author's note. The Scole Confession combines the real-life murder of Edward Moyes in Liverpool with the unsolved drowning of Fanny Nunn in Diss. Edward Moyes is a real person and was an evangelist in Tasmania. He returned to England after becoming the subject of a scandalous relationship. As usual, many characters in the Scole Confession existed. Some are creations of the author's imagination. You've been listening to The Scole Confession by Jacqueline Beard, narrated by Andrew Cullum, published by Whole Story Quest Audiobooks, an imprint of W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted 2020 Jacqueline Beard. This recording is copyrighted 2020 W.F. Howes Limited.